What does a map become when its ink runs out? What happens when the cartographer's hand hesitates at the edge of known space and the blank beyond begins to press back, not with emptiness, but with a presence that refuses to be ignored? The question lodged itself like a seed beneath the skin of the mission long before any vessel left the bay. It was not a question about coordinates or fuel, it was a question about expectation, about the very habit of treating the cosmos as territory rather than story. At the fringe of the Milky Way, where the spiral thins into scattered stars and the familiar hum of galactic traffic subsides into a hushed, cool dark, a survey. The expedition had a purpose that read like a modest instruction in a logbook. Chart the outer reaches, catalogue stellar remnants, refine models of galactic structure. There was elegance in its simplicity. A careful sweep across longitude and latitude, instruments tuned to tease out the faintest whispers of matter. Yet beneath that clean objective sat an older, more elemental drive, the human taste for horizons, the compulsion to name what had not been named. It was a program born of equations and budgets and grant panels, but it carried with it the weight of inherited curiosity, of myth. Preparations took years, and those years accumulated in quiet ways. Arrays that had been used to chart pulsars and to listen for the faint ballets of binary stars were recalibrated, repurposed. Algorithms accustomed to the predictable patterns of planetary transits were taught to be suspicious of patternlessness. Long baseline interferometers, cooled to temperatures that made their circuits whisper, were brought to bear. Instruments spent nights memorizing the baseline of background noise so that, when anything deviated from that baseline, the deviation would be visible as a small but undeniable disturbance, like the mission's vessel, an assembly of shields, gyroscopes, and patient electronics left behind the bright, busy lanes of intergalactic trade. It moved outward with a slow, deliberate dignity. The craft did not rush. In its chest, clocks ticked and data stacks filled, a steady accumulation of measurements that researchers would later parse in rooms lined with screens. There was an economy to this outward motion. To hurry would have been to trade precision for daring. To proceed too swiftly would have been to accept the map-maker's old compromise. For months, the survey unfolded almost as a meditation. The instruments translated distances into points, luminosities into colors, and the catalogue grew. A stream of small discoveries formed the background noise of the project, a failed protostar here, a diffuse nebula there, the quiet, elegant decay of a white dwarf gnawing at the last of its thermal glow. Each addition to the ledger felt incremental, the sort of accumulation that, in the long run, matters more than the headlines. But beneath that lid of routine, the vehicle's radar arrays kept returning to a particular swath of the sky. Then, one slow afternoon in mission time, the instruments registered something that did not belong to the pattern. The radar blip arrived, not as a loud declaration, but as a hesitant cough, an echo with a timbre that set the system's heuristic flags fluttering. On the display, a single return stood apart from the statistical sea, a subtle brightness in a line of noise that should have been subtracted away. The return suggested size and mass, but its profile matched none of the signatures the algorithms had been trained to expect. It was too diffuse for a solid body of rock, too compact for a gas cloud, and strangely silent across the bands where those who would later describe the moment used metaphors. An anomaly like a fossil where none should have been, an island rising out of a mapped ocean. But metaphors only begin to approximate the procedural reality. The array recalibrated, the software reran models, cross-checks were transmitted to other observatories. Instruments that had been pointed at supernovae and quasar jets turned their collecting surfaces toward the anomaly. For a time, the entire effort concentrated like a magnifying glass on that small point. Data streamed back. The object's radar signature suggested dimensions that shocked the initial parameters. The return implied a body with a diameter not typical of asteroids or even dwarf planets. Its motion, derived from successive sweeps, was not on a simple orbit around the galactic center. Instead, the trajectory hinted at a tangle of gravitational influences, like the memory of past encounters embedded in a motion that refused to be neatly categorized. There was mass, and there was the absence of expected emissions. If it was a star, it was not. But what then followed was not drama in the cinematic sense, but a slow, ritualized reassessment. Models were extended, boundaries widened. The team applied filters and subtracted backgrounds, folded in parallax corrections, and engaged in the ancient practice of making the improbable more comfortable by translating it into known terms. Each explanation was tested and found wanting. A dense, cold brown dwarf would have betrayed itself in infrared. A massive comet would have left a tail. Nothing fit. The object refused to be domesticated by analogues. Around this stubbornness accumulated a particular emotional texture. The prevailing mood blended curiosity with a distinct, careful fear. It was not fear of menace, it was a species of humility, the recognition that an entire system, instruments, theories, expectations had been nudged out of alignment. There was also a small, fierce delight, the kind reserved for those who glimpse, however briefly, the limits of their own maps. This delight was not loud. It was a quiet, almost guilty joy, the apprehension that something might be hiding just beyond the horizon. In rooms and data centers, the air changed. Beyond emotion, another layer pressed itself into the work. Time. Deep time is a difficult collaborator for those accustomed to annual budgets and grant cycles. It has patience, and it refuses to hurry. The object's radar return carried with it an implicit time signature, a suggestion of age that did not conform to human scales. The instruments could measure distances and velocities, but the object's history could only be guessed at through the traces it left on its surroundings. Dust lanes hinted at encounters that may have unfolded over millions of years. A muted glow suggested thermal processes that had been widened. Speculation flowered naturally, and the narrator of the project's public briefings, the calm voice meant to translate complexity into accessible meaning, used that space to temper imagination with restraint. The briefings were careful to avoid flights of fancy, to situate the detection within a hierarchy of probabilities. Yet even the sober language could not entirely banish the images that grew in the mind. A massive body stranded at the galactic rim like a forgotten relic, a structure so old it had outlived its makers, evidence of processes so patient that they could be measured only by instruments. For a speculative documentary voice, the discovery held particular rhetorical power. It allowed the narrator to connect the near-term procedural reality, arrays, reruns, cross-checks, with broader human themes. Why do humans continue to expand the margins of their knowledge? There is a narrow practical answer about resources and navigation, but a deeper, almost spiritual rationale persists, a commitment to replace blankness with understanding, to make the void legible. The moment the radar returned, that indeterminate echo, the mission did not merely find a new object, it abruptly acknowledged no immediate instruments could answer the most provocative questions. Could this body be an artifact of a civilization that had emerged near the fringe and then vanished without a trace? Could it be a structure or mass that recorded in its very form the echoes of behaviors long extinct? The data provided hints, not narratives. There were densities, not inscriptions, trajectories, not signatures of deliberate construction. Yet the possibility of a what if was enough to reshape priorities. Funding agencies, those pragmatic arbiters, shifted attention. Observatory committees debated. It would be irresponsible, the briefings emphasized, to jump from anomaly to artifact. And yet the human mind, equipped to find patterns and to narrate, did not remain idle. Hypotheses proliferated. The object might be a gravitational capture, a rogue body ensnared after a chance collision. It might be a fossilized remnant of a once brighter star, its radiation now spent but its mass intact. It might be a compact cluster of dark matter behaving in a way not fully predicted by current models. Each hypothesis brought with it predictions, and each prediction suggested new The narrative, as it matured, insisted on a particular tone, measured wonder. The voice that would guide listeners through the unfolding story had to be capable of holding two moods at once, the excitement of discovery and the humility before the unknown. It had to convey the procedural gestures without draining them of their poetic resonance. The radar's tentative return could be described as data, and it could also be described as a crack in the veil, a slit through which imagination peered. The mission's slow redirection of resources read as engineering. It also read as ritual. Telescopes were repositioned. At the same time, the discovery forced an unavoidable reflection on disappearance. The outer regions of a galaxy do not keep meticulous records. They are the places where traces are most easily erased by time, the heat signature bleached away, the dust spread thin by gravitational tides, inscriptions worn smooth by radiation. The human concept of a civilization wiped out by time becomes less a myth and more a statistical inevitability when one contemplates billions of years of unluminous history. Structures could have been raised and reduced to spectral echoes, entire centers of culture might have bloomed and faded, their artifacts dispersed. In those early days after detection, the mission's experiments multiplied. Instruments probed different wavelengths, looking for emissions that might betray internal heat or residual activity. Polarimetric studies searched for unusual scattering that could indicate structured surfaces. Spectroscopy, always the patient interrogator of light, attempted to read the chemical signatures of the returning photons. Each new dataset either narrowed the range of possibilities or widened it, like a conversation with an interlocutor who replies in words half-formed. And through it all, the public imagination was tuned to the broadcast of each finding. Press releases balanced precision and accessibility, mindful that the allure of outer space mysteries can tilt into fantasy. Commentators elsewhere found moral analogies. The object's silence became a metaphor for erased histories on Earth, for civilizations lost to their own carelessness or to environmental collapse. The poetic overlaps were not misplaced, they were human attempts to stitch cosmic discovery into the fabric of terrestrial meaning. The ship, the survey itself, both vessel and program, continued its work. It did not halt because a question had been posed. Rather, it redirected. And in doing so, it embodied a modest but profound civic virtue, the willingness to follow where evidence points, even when that path is inconvenient. That virtue is quiet. It does not make headlines the way speculation does. Yet it is the engine of knowledge, the slow accumulator that turns anomalies into understanding or, at least, into more precise questions. The detection at the edge of the Milky Way, then, was both a technical event and a philosophical one. It reminded those who listened that maps are living documents, revised by error and by wonder. It suggested that the margin, long dismissed as emptiness, can harbor surprises so substantial that entire programs reorient themselves. And it returned, like all good prompts, to a basic human posture, the readiness to be humbled. In the immediate aftermath, no conclusions were drawn beyond the modest and necessary ones. The data required patient analysis, models would be iterated, the fleet of telescopes would continue to point. But already the discovery had accomplished something larger than itself. It had reopened a conversation about how humanity understands time and erasure, about the fragile status of presence in a universe that, in its deep age, is more proficient at forgetting than humans are at remembering. The radar blip at the fringe was a small event in the cosmic ledger, but for the mission, and for those who would listen to its account, it became a doorway. Maps can be amended. But the best discoveries do not merely enlarge the map, they remind the maker, the map maker, the scientist, the listener, that the map is never the territory. The unknown at the Milky Way's rim invited that reminder and, in doing so, insisted that the act of looking remains among the most human of endeavors, small, temporary, and profoundly curious before the vast histories that lie waiting in the dark. What does a breath look like from across the gulf of interstellar night? It is a question that compresses scale into a single aching curiosity. Can the chemistry of a distant sky be read like a signature, a trace left by something that inhales and exhales, something that, for an instant, alters the composition of an entire world? The mission did not intend to answer this question on that particular sweep. It had been organized to map and to catalogue, to test the limits of sensitivity and patience. Yet the universe, indifferent to intent, sometimes arranges its clues in ways that force a change of plans. As the survey vessel closed on the anomaly identified at the rim, as telescopes tightened focus and optical systems balanced on the razor edge between photon economy and thermal noise, the instruments produced an image that was at once modest in appearance and monumental in implication. A planet, small and pale. The image itself was not cinematic. It appeared as a slender spike in a graph, the delicate troughs and peaks of a spectrum that specialists learn to read as others read handwriting. But for anyone attuned to what patterns can mean, that graph condensed into an instant, an answer to a question humanity had been framing for generations. Here was a sky that contained the same chemical markers that, on Earth, accompany life. Oxygen in abundance, molecular water suspended and moving, a telltale imbalance among the gases that resisted ease. Spectroscopy is an act of translation. Photons, carrying histories of collisions, emissions, and absorptions, arrive at collectors chilled and patient. They carry within their wavelengths the imprint of interaction with matter. When sunlight, or starlight, filters through an atmosphere, molecules take their toll. They snatch particular colors and leave gaps. Those gaps, measured and calibrated, become names. The mission's detectors, honed to a sensitivity that surprised them even now, recorded the pattern unambiguously. Oxygen absorption lines emerged clearly against the background star. Beyond the raw reading lay the deeper interpretive work. Oxygen is not a benign guest in planetary atmospheres. In many geochemical scenarios, it is a fleeting product, a reactive gas that binds readily with rocks, metals, and organics, and is consumed unless constantly replenished. To maintain a high concentration of free oxygen over geological timescales requires a persistent source. On Earth, that source has been the slow and patient alchemy of photosynthesis, microscopic life rearranging sunlight into bonds, exhaling oxygen as incidental waste. Water, meanwhile. The language of probability shifted quietly in those weeks that followed. Surveys that had, by design, treated biosignatures as rare anomalies recalibrated their priors. Where once oxygen detections at the edge of sensitivity were catalogued as curiosities, here they demanded the full machinery of verification. Teams reran calibrations, subtracted telluric contamination, checked for instrumental artifacts. Observatories on opposite sides of the star's field were asked to replicate the lines. Different methods: transit spectroscopy, direct reflected. And yet the mission's leaders, the collective voice of careful science, insisted on restraint. The public reads headlines faster than the machines can be adjusted, and the human appetite for certainty often outstrips the modes of inquiry that produce it. For every oxygen-rich spectrum there is a cautionary tale: planets where photodissociation splits water and leaves behind oxygen, worlds where hydrogen escapes to space, and oxygen accumulates abiotically, surfaces that oxidize and hold on to oxygen in ways that mimic biological replenishment. Every plausible, those exclusions were methodical, almost ritualized. Models of stellar ultraviolet flux were refined. How much ultraviolet light did the host star emit, and could it drive water photolysis on a scale sufficient to produce the observed oxygen? Planetary formation histories were re-examined. Could the planet have started with a massive inventory of water and, through atmospheric escape and chemical fractionation, ended up with an oxygen-rich shell? Geological models were turned like stones. Could volcanism or mineral oxidation explain the abundance? Each hypothesis was given the tools of falsity. A turning point was the discovery of disequilibrium. In chemistry and in planetary atmospheres, equilibrium is the expected state. Reactive gases find partners and reach a balance governed by energy flows and material availability. Disequilibrium suggests an ongoing process keeping the mix out of balance. On the planet in question, oxygen did not stand alone. There were hints, faint and tantalizing, of companion gases that, in Earth's case, coexist because of biological mediation. Methane, for example, if it were present alongside oxygen in sustained proportions, would be a striking sign. Beyond line chemistry, the images hinted at seasonal and spatial complexity. Polarization measurements suggested surfaces with varying reflectivity, patches that dim and brighten in a way consistent with rotating continents and oceans. Cloud patterns, tracked across multiple rotations, displayed cyclical variations. Where simple models of sterile atmosphere produce uniform albedo, here the world presented a textured face, belts of cloud movement that suggested heat redistribution, darker regions that hinted at large absorptive surfaces, and glints in the right geometries for liquid bodies. These were not definitive. The spectroscopic gamut continued to be probed, a subtle reflectance increase in the near-infrared, appearing at the edge of the spectrum where chlorophyll and analogous pigments absorb and then reflect, raised a further possibility. The red edge, as it is called in terrestrial biology, is a steep change in reflectivity associated with large-scale vegetation. On Earth, it is an emergent signal of ecology, a spectral thumbprint of photosynthetic life at planetary scale. The signal observed on the distant world was not a clean red edge, it was fragmentary and noisy. But it arrived with the pattern, seasonal modulation. The mission, like all disciplined inquiries, resisted the romance of immediate proclamation. The risk of false positives is not merely reputational. Mistaking geochemistry for biology would distort future allocations, mislead public understanding, and complicate the ethical frameworks that must eventually govern contact and study. So verification procedures multiplied. Multi-wavelength campaigns were launched. Instruments that could sense thermal fluxes searched for geothermal hotspots consistent with biological metabolism at depth. Radio surveys probed the star for those attuned to narrative, the sequence of signs read like the opening chapters of a larger book. Each observation added a paragraph, oxygen and water for the premise, methane bursts and variability for plot, polarimetric patterns and red edge-like slopes for texture. Yet the story remained provisional. The planet's atmosphere, after all, was a snapshot in cosmological time. Deep time, which had earlier made itself felt in the motion and muted glow of the anomaly at the rim, again asserted its presence. Atmospheres are ephemeral in planetary scales. They shift, thin, thicken, sometimes as this temporal uncertainty intensified the ethical tenor of the findings. What responsibilities attach to the interpretation of a planet whose breath might be a historical fossil? What are the moral implications of announcing a probable biosphere that, on closer inspection, is a fading rhythm? These are not merely metaphysical musings. They were practical considerations taken seriously by those who framed the public briefings. How to inform without inflaming, how to nurture curiosity without constructing myths that outpace the evidence. Public response was predictably complex. In some quarters, the data stirred a surge of optimism, a visceral relief that life's chemistry was not unique to Earth. In other quarters, it provoked skepticism, conspiratorial narratives, and the familiar rush to definitive claims before the science permitted them. Commentators drew metaphors between the planet's whisper and ancient human cultures lost to time, a fitting echo of the mission's earlier meditation on erasure. The discovery became, in the public imagination, a mirror, a planetary breath that reflected back fears and hopes about humanity's own longevity and stewardship. Within the halls of science, the detection reshaped resource allocation. Telescopes once committed to other programs were reprioritized. Collaborations formed across continents and bureaucracies to perform continuous monitoring. The ethics committees convened to draft protocols for disclosure and for any future intention to transmit. Philosophers, traditionally peripheral in these technical conversations, found a new seat at the table: how to talk about life in a way that honors both epistemic humility and the human need for meaning. Amid the flurry of activity, there remained a quieter, deeper tension. The planet's signs suggested life-friendly conditions, but life itself is not a single monolith. It is an ensemble of chemistries and histories, of emergences and extinctions, of resilience and fragility. The juxtaposition of oxygen and water with episodic methane and potential vegetation-like reflectance could mean a thriving biosphere, or it could indicate a world in transition, recovering from a catastrophe or slipping into a slow decline. The signs were not simply affirmative, they were chronological hints, each carrying within it science, for all its apparatus, ultimately deals in a kind of narrative provisionality. The interpreters of spectra and dynamics are storymakers restrained by methods. They propose causal arcs and subject them to tests, revising until the most economical explanation fits the data. At this stage of the mission, the most economical explanation was no longer a sterile world impulsively acquiring oxygen through photolysis. It was a world whose atmosphere bore the fingerprints of processes that, on Earth, correlate strongly with life. The probability assignments shifted. That numerical shift mattered less than the psychological one. Humanity had spent centuries alternating between two narratives about the cosmos, one of isolation and monopoly, the other of plenitude and cosmic teeming. The detection at the rim, evolving from mere anomaly to a candidate biosignature, navigated the space between those narratives. It did not offer resolution. Instead, it compressed the immense scales of time and space into an urgent deliberation. What does discovery mean when it is not discrete and unambiguous but gradated and historically contingent? In the months that followed, every aspect of the mission became an exercise in patience and imagination. Instruments were retasked to monitor temporal changes. Models were imbued with probabilistic reasoning that accepted uncertainty as a primary datum. Communication strategies were crafted to invite curiosity and discourage premature certainty. The planet remained a small, pale face in the vastness, its atmospheric lines ledgered into charts and journals. But the significance of the detection had already transcended the spectral plots. It had become a hinge. The discovery did not answer the question posed at the beginning of the sweep, it reframed it. Rather than asking whether a breath could be seen from light years away, the mission now confronted the broader query. What does it mean to recognize a breath at all? To recognize a dynamic atmosphere as life is to accept the risk of error, of being wrong about the causes, and to accept simultaneously the obligation to pursue the truth with tools that are themselves transient. In the vast ledger of deep time, the planet's spectral whisper is a small entry. Yet for those who listen, its presence is both promise and admonition. What does an orbit remember? That question sat like a small, persistent thought in the mission's collective consciousness, as telescopes resolved dozens of cylindrical silhouettes encircling the pale planet. An orbit is not merely a path, it is a ledger, a slow-moving archive that accumulates collisions, shadows, and transmissions. When many cylinders were first imaged glinting in the planet's twilight, they read not only as objects in motion but as entries in a lost history, each one a silent line in an otherwise blank chapter. Seen from afar, the cylinders were a geometry of repetition, an orchestra of forms playing a choreography that suggested purpose. They varied in scale, long, narrow tubes that might have been tethers or fuel tanks, squat, modular segments curved and jointed like the vertebrae of some deliberate construct. Their surfaces had the dull, pitted gleam of metal worked in cold, flaking coatings suggested long exposure to micrometeorite rain and the slow scouring of ionized particles. Some bore the matte sheen of oxidized alloys, others showed the crystalline frosting of volatiles condensed in shadow and sublimated in light. The distribution of the cylinders around the planet was not random. They clustered along several planes, forming loose belts at varying altitudes. A few occupied higher, more eccentric orbits. Others clung to low, nearly circular paths that skimmed the atmosphere's upper fringe. Some had trajectories that intersected with one another in long-period resonances, suggesting either coordinated placement or the slow re-sculpting of orbits by gravity and drag. Where there were intersections, there were shadows, wakes of particulate matter, and faint trails of sputtered material that betrayed signals arrived in a way that amplified the uncanny mix of geometry and silence. A subset of the cylinders emitted regular pulses, not the ragged chatter of random processors, but disciplined beats with intervals and amplitudes that repeated across years of remote monitoring. The pulses were not simple carrier waves, they carried modulations that hinted at structure. Spectral analyses revealed harmonics and sidebands, periodicities that suggested reference frames and clocks. Yet decoding attempts hit a wall. The emission patterns were neither obviously mathematical sequences nor clearly stochastic noise. The inadequacy of translation was as instructive as any success could have been. Instruments trained on pulsars and coded beacons had learned to read repetition as intention. Here, repetition existed. But the lexicon had shifted. Bit sequences were truncated, packets corrupted, timing markers drifted, as if the clocks themselves had aged into differing cadences. Attempts to align the pulses using terrestrial encoding schemes produced only the suggestion of structure, not content. Machine learning models trained on known telemetry formats oscillated between often. That unintelligibility produced an emotion that was at once technical and existential. The reaction among the networks of observatories was not the cinematic gasp of alien contact, but a quieter, more complicated feeling, a small, careful grief for a language that had once existed and had been lost to the erosion of epochs. There was also a thrill, an intellectual itch, the recognition that these emissions were traces of habit. Machines do not keep to cycles without cause, they are synchronized to something, and synchronization implies purpose. The pulses for an instant, decisions about response were procedural and sober. International panels, ethics boards, and planetary protection committees convened with the same steady language they used for any high-stakes moment: caution, verification, non-contamination. The presence of functioning transmitters, however obtuse their content, complicated the calculus. On one hand, the possibility of meaningful signals suggested evidence of processes that had persisted long enough to leave technical residues. On the other, any attempt to intercept, reply, or physically approach risked disturbing the very thing being observed. The mission's decision-making apparatus, shaped by treaties and by preparing, meant planning a descent that honored both scientific curiosity and the ethical imperatives of care. The first landing would not be a dramatic touchdown with banners and human voices. It would be a slow, methodical probing, an expedition of instruments designed to read surface chemistry, to sample without scarring, to photograph with light and shadow rather than excavation. The objective was narrow and deliberate: approach one of the larger cylinders that occupied a low, stable orbit and attempt to establish whether its configuration was artificial in the deliberate sense. Orbital mechanics dictated much of the choreography. Planners selected a probe that could survive atmospheric abrasion, that could deorbit with controlled burns, that carried passive and active sensors optimized to pick apart reflective materials and resonance signatures. Descent profiles were simulated not just for aerodynamic stability, but for the avoidance of secondary impacts among the dense field of orbiters. The risk assessments read like a litany of potentialities: collision with a rotating cylinder generating a cascade of debris, the interaction of descent thrusters with volatile deposits on the cylinder's surface. Public commentary interfaced with these technical deliberations in predictable ways. The cultural imagination gravitated to metaphors of graveyards and spacecraft as monuments. Philosophers argued about the ethics of touching relics at orbital gravesites. Conservation-minded voices proposed that the orbit itself be designated as a protected heritage zone, arguing that human curiosity ought not to efface the evidentiary record of another epoch. Others insisted that the scientific value of direct sampling, of determining composition, construction methods, and signs of repair or maintenance, outweighed the risks of contamination. Funders and the descent began like a patient argument translated into motion. The probe, a compact geometry of alloy and radiators, slipped from orbital insertion and threaded a path through the cylinder field. Cameras recorded the cylinder's silhouettes pass in slow sequence, their surfaces close enough to resolve saddles, struts, and the occasional radiating array. Sensors listened to the background hiss of plasma and recorded micrometeor impacts as transient spikes. In the images there were details that suggested manufacture, repetitive ribs along hulls, apertures that looked engineered rather than erosional. Approach vectors were adjusted in real time based on imaging. The probe's descent plume was modulated to minimize imparted momentum to nearby objects. In a slow, deliberate ballet, the craft lowered to a region where a cluster of cylinders formed a loose chain, a segment of orbital infrastructure that lay close enough to the atmosphere to have accrued frost and regolith on its sun-facing surfaces. There was concern about electrostatic adhesion. Small particles raised by thruster wash could cling and move like flocked dust. Engineers had anticipated this, and limited plume power recorded. Touchdown was a technical success measured in telemetric numbers, deceleration rates within expected tolerances, structural stresses below yield thresholds, and a positional fix that placed the probe on a broad ring segment. But the meaningful moment was not mechanical. When the landing cameras panned and the first light hit the cylinder's flank at close range, instruments recorded a surface that read like a palimpsest. Layers of deposit overlaid with intentional patterning. There were regular perforations along a tubular seam that suggested vents or optics. Adjacent panels bore a faint, repeating motif of raised ridges. The probe's instruments began a protocol of passive sampling before engaging any intrusive action. Spectrometers, careful and cool, read absorption features that suggested composite alloys, materials that combined refractory metals with lighter structural elements. The distribution of compounds suggested a technology that favored repairable modularity, seams that could be unlatched, tie points where attachments could have been secured, and the residue of adhesives that hinted at past human-like care for maintenance. There were also deposits containing isotopic ratios that pointed to cycles of solar interaction. Elements attempts to access internal compartments were intentionally minimal. The probe's arm, delicate and instrumented for gentle interaction, nudged a panel that had become brittle. The contact triggered a cascade of tiny particles, a microcloud of dust that the cameras recorded in exquisite slow frames. Those particles, when analyzed by the probe's microspectrometer, yielded organic signatures that were not unmistakably biological but were chemically complex, chains and rings of carbon compounds, sulfidic residues, and trace phosphorus concentrations. Each chemical clue, signals from the orbiters that had been transmitting with regularity, responded to the probe's presence, but not in a way that resembled conversation. There were shifts in pulse timing and amplitude. Some transmitters increased output as if to counteract interference. Others fell silent, perhaps damaged by micrometeorite strikes or by the perturbations induced by the probe. The change in the transmission field suggested that the orbiting network had been a living system, nodes and repeaters that responded to environmental changes, perhaps coordinated by timing references now scrambling under new inputs. The telemetry yielded no decipherable messages, but its dynamism was. Across distant control rooms and lecture halls, the landing's data were passed in a tone that mixed triumph and inhibition. There was exhilaration at the resolution of the images and the richness of returned spectra. There was also an austerity about what could be asserted. The probe had not delivered a clear message or a smoking gun. It had instead furnished a complex collection of traces, manufacture, materials, residues, that an engineering intelligence had once existed and perhaps persisted in some degraded form. The presence of ongoing transmissions complicated the simple narrative. The broader cultural reaction threaded together hope and a new kind of humility. artists and historians treated the orbit as an archive of another civilization's quotidian life. Tether lines like streets, modules like dwellings, transmitters like lighthouse beacons. Philosophers used the event to reopen questions about stewardship and the preservation of alien material culture. How should one treat objects that bore the marks of care and yet were suspended in silence? What obligations did an occupying species have toward artifacts whose provenance and meaning were irretrievably in? At times, the landing's most profound effect was on temporal perception. The cylinders, when seen in the intimate detail of close-up shots, forced a recalibration of human timelines. What had looked like ruin at first glance now revealed traces of sequential repair, patches and rivets that implied maintenance cycles, abrasion in specific directions that suggested habitual orientation. Time had been practiced there, not as the sudden arc of a human lifespan, but as the slow, methodical labor of upkeep across epochs. Such labor implied social. Planetary protection protocols followed the landing with renewed vigor. Samples that could be returned to human laboratories were carefully bagged in containment, and in parallel, a policy document was drafted to govern any future, more intrusive actions. That document, read as a covenant across time, commit to non-destructive study unless the scientific case and ethical frameworks demanded otherwise, preserve in situ as much material as possible to keep the orbit's record intact, and recognize that the act of study itself is an intervention with moral weight. The language was sober, intentionally bureaucratic, because the bureaucracy sought to slow the rush. In quiet moments between public briefings and technical updates, the narrative took a more reflective turn. The cylinders in orbit, their ongoing but unreadable transmissions, and the results of the first landing collectively functioned as a new kind of mirror. They reflected back the human tendency to ascribe continuity and meaning to artifacts, to imagine lives, schedules, and intentions behind mechanical repetition. They also reminded listeners that the universe keeps records on scales incommensurate with human attention. Clocks that once coordinated transmissions might now be misaligned by fractions that defeat. The first landing did not, in any dramatic sense, resolve the mysteries. It deepened them, adding textures and laws to the question of what had been and what persisted. It did what careful science does. It turned speculation into evidence, and it turned evidence back into refined questions. The orbit remembered, and the probe recorded, that memory in grainy frames, in spectra, in the faint chorus of transmitters that persisted on the edge of comprehension. For those who watched and listened, the landing was less an arrival than a commitment to patient interpretation, to ethical restraint, and to the slow work of reading with humor. What does a city look like when language has forgotten its nouns? That question, more than any map or measurement, framed the mission's decision to touch down. It was not an inquiry about coordinates or structural integrity alone. It was a philosophical hinge. If the orbit retained a ledger of machines and muted transmissions, the surface promised a different kind of archive, patterning not only in metal and alloy, but in flows of matter and energy that might be read as routines, habits, a civic life written across a coastline where sea met plain. The choice to aim for a broad, level plain near the planet's seashore was pragmatic and symbolic in equal measure. Plains near water are, on any world, places of exchange, gradients in temperature and chemistry, sediment and nutrient fluxes, and, on inhabited planets, meeting points between land-bound organization and mobile, oceanic processes. From the mission's perspective, such a site offered the best chance to observe the interface between whatever lingered in orbit, whatever persisted in the atmosphere, and whatever, if anything, still operated at the planetary surface. Instrument teams argued in descent planning read like an act of exegesis. Sensors were arranged to capture not only topography but behavior over time, multispectral images tasked to watch diurnal changes, LiDAR to resolve blocky geometries at centimeter scales, magnetometers and gravimeters to infer mass distribution beneath the crust. The probe's trajectory was conservative, low-angle approach to minimize disturbance, redundant telemetry to ensure that every environmental reaction could be recorded and contextualized. There was an institutional discipline behind the motion, a refrain that echoed the mission. The first images of the landing site were at once disorienting and clarifying. From orbital altitudes, the coastline presented a measured sweep of pale sands and darker tidal flats. As the probe's sensors closed the scale, a coastline that had seemed natural from afar revealed arrangements that refused a purely geological reading. Standing along the plain were monolithic, block-like constructions, enormous in scale, planar faces meeting at right angles, regular lattices that recurred across kilometers. They were not the soft erosional shapes expected from wind and water. They read like mass geometry, stacks, The blocks themselves were puzzling. Spectrometers returned signatures that did not map neatly onto terrestrial materials. There was a high reflectivity across a swath of infrared that implied a matrix of reflective crystalline phases embedded within a tougher, darker substrate. Elemental analyses taken at a distance suggested the presence of refractory elements in unusual ratios, alloys that combined lightweight lattices with dense, radiation-tolerant bands. Some surfaces bore filigree, like microstructures that altered reflectivity depending on incident angle, a property the teams labeled anisotropic sheening. Where light struck those for scale intensified the sensory metaphor. The blocks were not monoblocks but modules, connected with seams and junctions that suggested assembly. Some seams showed evidence of mechanical interlocks, others displayed residues that matched degradation products of adhesives. Where terraces abutted tidal flats, there were channel-like depressions. Where block faces met the ocean, the water shaded into deeper, darker hues, hinting at submerged continuities. From altitude, patterns suggested pathways or thoroughfares. Long, linear depressions connecting clusters of blocks, nodes of deeper cavities at intersections. For view, but the sign of urbanity was not only in form. Signals of process arrived in many subtle registers. Thermal cameras trained across the steady dusk and cold of a planetary night registered diurnal cycles that did not track purely with insulation. Some block faces warmed and cooled in phases offset from their immediate illumination, as if internal processes, pumps or metabolic-like flows, regulated heat flux. Electromagnetic sensors detected patterned fluctuations across millimeter to radio bands, low-level harmonics, and pulsed activity that waxed and waned with tidal cycles. The coastline's interface with the sea became a focal dialectic between persistence and change. Coastal depressions filled at high tide with a water that carried, on spectroscopic reading, subtle organic complexity, macromolecules with backbone signatures that did not match known terrestrial biopolymers but that nonetheless displayed polymeric behaviors. Chain formation, cross-linking, fractal branching. Planktonic blooms, if that was the right word, flared in localized bays at certain times, visible as increased reflectance and chlorophyll. Absorption bands in narrow spectral windows. The mission's biology group restrained. Perhaps the most unnerving and compelling aspect of the site was movement that suggested organized flow without identifiable actors. Nighttime imagery revealed a choreography of light and shadow across the terraces. Ridges along certain block faces illuminated in slow cascades, as if light were being shunted through embedded channels. Long, low beams of radiative intensity traced along planned edges and then dimmed, only to blaze elsewhere in another pattern. The effect was not random flicker, but a metered choreography with repeatable motifs. When these patterns were overlaid on tidal charts, analogues on Earth appeared in the advisory memos. Coral reefs as infrastructure built by organisms, termite mounds as environmental regulation authored by countless small builders, smart city grids as networks coordinating lights and flows. These comparisons were evocative but also imprecise. The city's materials suggested both manufacture and biological transformation. Surfaces of certain blocks bore a veiling film that, under microscopic analysis, displayed growth-like accretion, layered deposition of mineral-organic matrices conforming to perforations and seams. In some depressions, the film formed filamentous The choice of a landing site therefore acquired moral weight. To set foot upon a plane that showed both manufacture and metabolic-like dynamics risked erasing records with every physical interaction. Contamination protocols, already strict for planetary protection, were amplified into an almost ritualistic choreography. The mission's governing committees convened in sober panels to discuss the ethics of proximity. Preservationists argued that the surface should be catalogued in situ as completely as remote sensing allowed. Others countered that only direct sampling would answer fundamental questions about the material's provenance, and robotic systems became the mission's delicate hands. Autonomous skimmers and tethered platforms were deployed to skim the tidal margins like cautious tongue, sampling an unfamiliar taste. They carried arrays that recorded phase changes in surface films, collected micro amounts of gel-like deposits, and took time-lapse imagery across tidal cycles. The skimmers documented ritualistic exchange at the waterline. As the tide rose, channels in the blockwork channeled water into shallow pan-like hollows where the film thickened as the tide fell. Solutes concentrated and then moved through subterranean conduits. The probe's chemical assays returned if the city was alive, its life was distributed and infrastructural rather than localized to individual organisms. Energy flows routed through blockwork, thermal buffers regulated microclimates, and surface films mediated exchanges between mineral and seawater. Networks of channels and compartments resembled logistics systems, conduits for material, capacitive facades that stored heat, and electromagnetic beacons that synchronized distant elements. In effect, the plane presented a civilization of process, a civic metabolism written in metallurgy and polymer, in tidal. That reframing altered the mission's questions. Instead of focusing solely on whether life in the biological sense existed, the inquiry broadened. How had forms of agency, technological, biological, and hybrid, been assembled into civic-scale processes? Could a city be both artifact and organism, a distributed system where repair, adaptation, and even forms of memory were encoded in materials and flows? The idea unsettled familiar taxonomies. It demanded new conceptual tools, measures of systemic persistence, indices of repair work, and metrics of information flow. Public reaction, predictably, filled the interpretive vacuum with narrative. For some, the city on the plain was a monument to the universality of urbanity, a convergence of form where any sufficiently complex system arranges itself into nodes and arteries. For others, the site was an allegory, coastal ruins that evoked the ephemerality of human endeavors on Earth. A quieter cohort, composed of historians of technology and philosophers, pressed a different point. Whether the structures were animated by a once sentient species or by emergent, non-anthropomorphic processes was less immediately significant than what the city said about it. Within the mission itself, the discovery reframed priorities without eliminating prior constraints. The orbiter's transmissions, previously treated as curiosities, were now contextualized as part of a planetary communication ecology. Did the pulse patterns encode maintenance schedules, tidal synchronizations, or error correction protocols for distributed systems? Could the anisotropic surfaces be adaptive skin that modified thermal loads in response to ocean chemistry? Every hypothesis demanded a different set of observations, and every observation risked altering the very system being observed. The plane yielded its data slowly and insistently. Patterns that had seemed static revealed seasonal modulation across multiple planetary rotations. Channels scoured and refilled in ways that implied ongoing sediment transport. Some block faces displayed fresher abrasion, where currents concentrated particulate flows. Other faces showed mineral accretion as if calcification was still ongoing. These signs complicated a binary reading of dead or alive. Instead, the mission encountered a continuum. Systems in various modes of decay, repair, adaptation, and latent activity. The notion of a vibrant city took on a careful precision. Vibrancy did not mean bustle in the human sense. It meant layered, ongoing processes, energetic exchanges between ocean and infrastructure, molecular cycles concentrating and redistributing resources, thermal beats that pulsed with tidal rhythms, and electromagnetic signals that threaded the plane like a nervous system. The city's vitality might be the residue of long-term engineering, the echo of past stewardship, or the trace of emergent processes that continued in the absence of their original designers. This realization reframed the moral calculus again. If urbanity could manifest without present cognition, if systems could maintain civic rhythms by virtue of their architecture and materials, then the act of study itself required a preservationist humility. The conservationists pressed for legal protections, designate the plane as an interplanetary heritage site, codify non-invasive protocols, and prioritize in situ preservation over retrieval. Scientists argued that certain questions could only be answered by selective sampling. Negotiations ensued, careful and precise. In the end, the mission adopted a posture consonant with its founding principle, patient inquiry married to moral restraint. It would watch, it would measure, it would allow time for the city to reveal more of its rhythms across seasons and cycles. A small, sealed sampler would collect minimally intrusive specimens locked in protocols meant to prevent cross-contamination and to preserve as much contextual information as possible. And, perhaps most importantly, the mission would treat the plane as an object lesson. In deep time, the city was not merely an artifact to be excavated and consumed by knowledge, it was a testament to the persistence of pattern. The plain near the sea, with its blockwork and its shimmering materials, its channels and its pulses, became for the mission an object of a new kind of reverence. The instruments recorded, and the scientists interpreted, and the ethicists cautioned. Together they produced a narrative that resisted neat closure. Here was a place that had been shaped by processes of care and engineering, that still exhibited lively functions, and that compelled a species of attention that recognized its own briefness. The city, in its terrible and beautiful ambiguity, functioned as a mirror. It reflected not only the possibility that complex arrangements of matter and what, the mission wondered, does a city say when it has traded speech for light? The question arrived not as a rhetorical flourish, but as an instrument reading, a pattern of photons that implied circulation, choreography, and purpose, yet emitted no audible testament to motion. From orbit, the plane had looked like a field of ruins. From the surface, with instruments close and patient, it organized itself into something more complicated, a functioning urbanity that spoke in lumens and fields, not in the clatter and rumble the team had associated with industry. It resembled an excavation of an ancient plan, a place where civic geometry persisted even as approach to the coastal terrace unfolded as a sequence of careful experiments. Low-flying drones traced long-exposure photographs of the plane at night, their sensors capturing faint streaks that only revealed themselves when time was allowed to braid discrete frames into continuity. Those streaks were not the smoke wakes of combustion engines, nor the hot plume signatures of chemical rockets. They were lines of polarized light, narrow, bright filaments that arced between nodes and along corridors. When the exposure windows were short, the filaments were ghosts. When the windows lengthened, an invisible choreography appeared, regular arcs linking. The transport system hypothesized from these traces was a thing of unusual elegance. Rather than visible vehicles making noise and stirring air, the infrastructure operated through guided electromagnetic flows. Long, low ridges embedded in the blockwork functioned like rails for traveling fields. Instruments that probed magnetic fluxes measured gradients consistent with moving magnetic lattices, traveling wave systems where the pattern of a field itself migrated along structured guides carrying payloads coupled via non-contact means. Where the ridges ran parallel to the coast, instruments recorded alternating field nodes that suggested directional control and velocity modulation. Silence, in a place designed for flow, sharpened perception. The absence of mechanical noise made other processes audible in their own subtle registers, the whisper of tide upon engineered quays, the micro-crackle of salts shifting across a seam as humidity changed. the inaudible but sensor-visible flicker of electronic arrays cycling through maintenance checks. The recorded silence produced an emotional effect that was not merely aesthetic. It introduced a question about intention. Had the designers preferred quiet? Had the city learned to convert kinetic waste into other forms and so avoided airborne noise? Or had time, spectral analysis provided partial answers? The glowing ribbons of the transport system registered strong emissions across narrow, tunable bands, often clustered in the green portion of the visible spectrum, but with harmonics extending into near-infrared. The light was not merely illumination, it was energy in motion, a carrier for guided power transfers, signaling and environmental conditioning. Photonic coupling between nodes transmitted not just control information, but usable energy gradients that could accelerate and decelerate magnetically levitated payloads without frictional wear. The effect was a city whose circulatory system, if transportation made its presence known primarily through light and field, the city's energetic economy was equally tuned to low footprint. Renew of the city's illumination was literal and symbolic. Biosynthetic arrays along the terraces, swaths of material with strong red edge reflectance that suggested chlorophyll-like absorption profiles, and tidal collectors hidden in shallow channels. The energy budget reconstructed by the mission's analysts read like a catalogue of sustainability across deep time. Surface films harvested sunlight at angles that maximized total integrated flux, their graded porosities acting like optical concentrators that reduced thermal losses. The interplay of these sources produced a civic lighting scheme that could be described as both economical and intentional. During the local day, the terraces absorbed and stored excess radiative energy. At night, that stored energy returned not as indiscriminate illumination, but as focused, situational radiance. Walkways brightened along scheduled arcs, quay faces pulsed to coordinate loading cycles, corridors hummed invisibly as fields prepared to accept payloads. The green glow, observable across kilometers, was not celebratory but functional, a visible ledger of the city's circulation. Yet the visible was only part of the city's communication palette. The orbiter network's transmissions, which had earlier been described as rhythmic but unreadable, now acquired context. Ground sensors recorded correlations between surface radiance patterns and orbital pulse sequences. Pulses from orbit increased slightly in amplitude when coastal corridors completed certain cycles. They adjusted phase in response to tidal maxima. This synchronization suggested a multi-tiered coordination system, local control loops managing immediate circulation, and a higher distributed timing layer anchoring long-period tasks. The reason the city emitted a particular scene crystallized the uncanny harmony. During a long night observation, the tide rose and the coastal channels filled. In the low light, cameras recorded a slow succession of green filaments advancing along quay faces. At the same time, thermal arrays registered mild drops in surface temperatures at specific nodes, as if heat had been pulled into internal reservoirs. The orbital pulse schedule tightened, then relaxed. The effect resembled a municipal service cycle: input, storage, distribution. No voices, no human hand. That observation deepened a set of interpretive tensions. If the city functioned as a process rather than a stage for discrete actors, how should the mission classify its vitality? The language of biology, metabolism, homeostasis, adaptation seemed apt at the systemic level, while the language of engineering, redundancy, materials, control loops fitted the local artifacts. The city defied simple categories, a hybrid ecology where infrastructure and chemistry enacted roles usually divided between organism and machine. The researchers grew cautious about anthropology. Silence, again, proved instructive. Acoustic recordings confirmed negligible audible mechanical signatures across the plain, but other bands told a noisier story. Subsonic and ultrasonic sensors detected energy exchanges, slow strains in structures, and high-frequency carrier modulations used for local positioning that simply lay outside the human audible range. It was plausible that the city's designers had deliberately shifted their operational soundscape beyond the range of flesh-based ears, either to shield processes from predation or to preserve a quiet environment for forms of life with different sensitivities. Whatever the causal story, the silence created an ethical pressure. The mission's teams, observing a city that had learned to be quiet, felt an almost filial obligation to remain so. The tension crystallized in procedural debates. Should active probes move in to map subterranean conduits and sample the films that regulated tidal exchange, or should the city be monitored and left untouched in hopes of allowing it to reveal itself further? The procedural memos read like moral inventories. Preservationist arguments emphasized minimal intervention. Utilitarian ones argued that carefully designed samples could resolve foundational questions about origin. The skimming platforms moved like curious tongues. Designed for non-destructive contact, they sampled microlayers of polymeric films of the waterline and drew nanoliters of brine from tidal pans. Chemical assays returned a mix of polymeric organics and complex inorganic scaffolding. The organics displayed repeating motifs, backbone architectures with heteroatom substitutions uncommon in Earth biochemistry. At the same time, mineral matrices showed gradations of density and anisotropy consistent with materials engineered for radiative control and ionic exchange. The emotional registers among the observing teams were varied and intense. What the instruments recorded produced awe that was not simply the pleasure of discovery, but a deeper, more reverent regard. Scientists felt a small, shared humility. They were witnessing systems that engineered their continuation across timescales humans struggled to imagine. That humility carried a frisson of responsibility. Researchers became acutely aware that each probe, each sampling pass, was an act that could erase or alter a narrative written into matter over epochs. Anxiety accompanied the thread. The silent city also amplified existential reflections. It was possible, and increasingly plausible, that the city's designers had moved away from noisy, labor-intensive modalities precisely because they would not survive long in the face of the universe's slow hand. Systems that conserved energy, avoided wasteful noise, and encoded repair into materials were more likely to persist. Viewed through deep time, silence might be not an absence, but an evolved strategy for endurance. The mission's reports began to include passages that read like philosophical footnotes about the form's persistence. Public discourse wavered between wonder and projection. On streaming commentaries, pundits spoke of ghost cities, poets of cities that sleep in light, and ethicists urged careful stewardship. But in the scientific briefings, the voice returned always to method, to measurable rates, to power budgets, to the documented correlation between orbital pulses and surface cycles. The narrative advanced by data, slow and patient, refused the temptations of melodrama. There were moments of near-poetic clarity. A camera, on a survey arc, captured the plane at a transitional hour. The sun kissed the terraces obliquely, revealing microtextures on the block faces, striations where fields had once anchored, pitted residues of past bondings, and prismatic facets that refracted the morning into filaments of emerald green. Across the quay, the tide retreated, leaving slender films that reflected the sky like green glass. In that still frame, the city read simultaneously as ruin and as a logic of maintenance. As the mission continued, the city resisted simplification. Its transport was clearly functional, its energy economy impressively sustainable, and its soundscape deliberately or incidentally muted. Yet whether those systems were run by sentient hands, by distributed automatons, or by emergent material processes remained unresolved. The city had answers, but not in the idioms humans expected. It communicated in timing, spectral modulation, and material gradients, in rhythms that could be read only by instruments trained to admit the possibility that civic life might not always end. In the end, the plane's greatest lesson was not a single finding, but a recalibration of expectation. The mission had begun with a map and the intention to extend its lines. It had found instead an example of how cities can endure and express themselves when the loud narratives are stripped away. The green lights and silent rails taught a new grammar, that functionality need not be noisy to be active, that maintenance can be a choreography of fields and films, and that persistence across deep time tends toward efficiencies that confound the sensory assumptions of their discoverers. The mission recorded, analyzed, and argued. It drafted protections, limited interventions, and allowed time for the city to reveal more patterns across seasons. Observers learned to listen without ears and to be patient with a place that had long since learned to be quiet. The plane did not need human language to be intelligible. It had a syntax of light and tide, of photonic highways and green energy economies. What remained was for listeners to adjust, to expand the senses of inquiry, and to recognize that silence can be a sign of life as eloquent as any roar. What does a greeting sound like when it cannot be spoken with words? What does a first cautionary step look like when the participants do not share the same history of touch or the same vocabulary for intent? These were not only procedural questions for committees and instruments, they were moral ones. They framed the pause between recognition and response, the moment when a species discovers not only another body in the world, but another set of norms for being in the world. The first visible sign was measured and careful. Sensors recorded silhouettes at a distance that human protocols defined as safe, a buffer of kilometers, a margin calibrated to reduce the likelihood of error, collision, and misreading. Within that buffer, cameras and hyperspectral imagers resolved forms that defied immediate analogy. They were tall and slender, their limbs elongated into graceful rods that suggested a different gravity or a different architecture of stress. The skin caught light in a way instruments described with the language of optics, a metallic sheen that shifted across a narrow spectrum. The beings did not approach like invaders or like emissaries. They remained arranged at a respectful distance, a halo of presence. Their obscure, if posture was the right word, suggested both caution and an intentional avoidance of the sort of intimacy that might scar or alarm the local ecology. Observational instruments registered faint rhythmic modulations along their bodies, pulses of light that ran as bands along limbs and across torso planes. Those pulses were not ornamental. Spectrographic analysis showed defined peaks and troughs in narrow optical bands, patterns that repeated with periodicity and displayed modulation akin to amplitude. Interpretation began as the slow, careful work that had become the mission's hallmark. Signal processing groups approached the phenomena as they approached any novel dataset, with skepticism sharpened by expertise. The light patterns were decomposed into orthogonal bases, harmonic analyses sought underlying periodicities, information theory framed the pulses in terms of entropy and redundancy. The low-frequency waves were examined with geophysical rigor, their waveforms isolated from wind and tide compared against known biophysical and industrial signatures. What emerged was the impression of choreography. The human response was similarly staged and intentional. International accords and years of protocol developed around hypothetical contact insisted on restraint. Observation came first. Synthetic replies were crafted by arrays of LEDs and acoustic transducers designed to mimic the alien's multimodal medium without presuming linguistic equivalence. Those replies were conservative, short sequences of patterns, scaled in time to match the alien's slower cadences, and designed to be non-threatening in energy and in form. Observations recorded whether the responding pulses elicited reciprocal modulation. Emotion in the rooms that watched the feeds was collective and complicated. There was the distilled excitement that comes from evidence of something new. There was relief that the visitors kept distance rather than closing with a rapidity that left the protocols untested. There was also an undercurrent of vulnerability. The strange but acute realization that human instruments had been trained to catch photons and pressure waves, not social intent, and that the first contact required a different kind of listening. The sensation resembled standing on a long shore and hearing an unfamiliar song across the water. It was beautiful. Public narratives multiplied. Editorials debated the cultural consequences, faith communities invoked, theologies newly confronted with embodiment and exobiology. Artists produced meditations that tried to imagine what a mirror of eyes like those might see in a cornfield or a city. The discourse pivoted between wonder and caution. Among scientists, the discussion remained procedural but never dry. What was the minimum necessary set of responses? Which stimuli could be emitted without causing ecological perturbation? A consensus hardened into a posture. That posture mattered because the first moments of contact are fragile. Communication is not merely about information transfer, it is about trust building. Silence, slow response, matched cadences, and the avoidance of coercive intensities all signal a respect for difference. The visitor's multimodal signals, the interleaving of soft light and infrasound, set a tempo that human practices could echo without appropriation. The graded pulses used light like a syntax of attention, emphasis, pause, baseline. The low-frequency waves, the site where these first exchanges occurred, added its own resonances. The beings had positioned themselves near a landscape of human cultivation, fields of an old domesticated crop that for millennia had been a companion to human settlements. From the air, the geometry of the fields read like tessellations, rows and contours shaped by seasons of planting, harvest, and irrigation. The crop itself was corn, maize, a plant that carries with it a human narrative almost as old as sedentary civilization, domestication, and codependence. To those who watched the feeds, the presence of such a crop in the observation confirmed a pattern that amplified the symbolic resonance. Cameras showed the visitors oriented, repeatedly, toward the rows. Their light pulses altered in cadence when aligned with particular terraces, low-frequency rhythms synchronized with the wind through stalks in particular valleys. From a distance, where neither species could touch the other, there appeared to be a curious cross-modal attunement. The being's light bands and infrasound co-varied with the agricultural microclimate. Spectrographic images showed light modulation that emphasized wavelengths near those reflected preferentially by the plant. A set of hypotheses emerged, each treated with institutional circumspection. One possibility was benign curiosity, a recognition of living patterns and rhythmic processes that reinforced the visitor's interest in stability and in interactive systems. Another considered function. Perhaps the visitors used low-frequency sound and specific light modulation to stimulate plant responses, to probe stomatal openings, or to activate photochemical cycles. A third entertained more complex coevolutionary narratives. Could these beings have independently developed practices of tending and shaping other species? Testing such ideas required sensitivity. Experiments were designed to observe without disrupting. Arrays of low-intensity lamps and subsonic emitters were positioned at distances intended to simulate the visitor's external modulation, and microphysiological sensors were planted in sample stalks to monitor stomatal conductance, sap flow, and electromagnetic emissions associated with cellular activity. The resulting data were small effects in magnitude but suggestive in direction, slight changes in sap flux coincident with low-frequency pulses, modest shifts in optical reflectance following particular modulation sequences. None of these results claimed the cultural reverberations were immediate. Anthropologists and agricultural historians were drawn into policy meetings, arguing that if the visitors were indeed registering cultivated life as meaningful, then the encounter should be treated not only as diplomatic, but as ecological. The crop fields were not simply agricultural commodities, they were archives, repositories of selective practice, gene histories, and embodied cultural labor. There was a renewed urgency in cataloging seed lines, in freezing genetic banks, in recording not only the genome of these crops, but the human practices that had shaped them. Seeds became emblematic, small, philosophical conversations thickened. The image of tall, patient beings orienting toward rows of corn provoked reflections about what it means to be recognized by the world one has shaped. Human beings tend to imagine themselves as active shapers of environments, but domestication also makes species vulnerable. Selective breeding creates dependencies. The visitor's attention to the crop acted as a mirror. It revealed the degree to which human endurance is tethered to fragile strands of biology. The prospect that another intelligence might view cultivated fields with the same mixture of marvel and caution reframed domestication as a cosmic. Practical consequences followed. Conservation policies were reframed. Protocols for non-invasive sampling were strengthened with seed-saving priorities. In agricultural stations and local communities near the contact site, there was a surge in seed banking and in the documentation of traditional planting knowledge. The event underscored a lesson already etched into the mission's ethos: deep time rewards redundancy and care, and the things most likely to persist across epochs are those deliberately tended. The exchanges between species continued in cautious modulation. Light pulses grew more complex, as if learners on both sides were layering grammar onto base patterns. Low-frequency waves developed phasing relationships with tidal and agricultural rhythms. The visitors seemed to calibrate their signals to match the planet's own cycles. No linguistic equivalence was established, no words, as humans would define them, crossed the gulf. Yet something resembling mutual translation evolved, a grammar of rhythm and attention in which cultivation, timing, and reciprocal restraint were the central moves. That grammar carried with it a new humility. It did not promise immediate comprehension or convenient contact. Instead, it taught a form of ethics, the responsibility to listen attentively to nonverbal rhythms, to maintain the integrity of small, living archives, and to avoid the hubris of assuming that making contact grants the right to take. The cornfields, quiet and unassuming, became emblematic of this ethic. They were at once fragile and testamentary, a living history of human selection and care, and they now functioned as a humble. In the months that followed, the corpus of observation expanded at a deliberate tempo. Repeated cycles of light and low-frequency response were logged and modeled. Cross-disciplinary teams, optics specialists, plant physiologists, acoustic engineers, cultural historians convened weekly to fit fragments of evidence into coherent patterns. The findings accumulated as cautious increments, correlation here, marginally significant physiological response, there, consistent adjustments in the visitor's modulation patterns when seedlings were replaced or when harvesting altered the landscape. No definitive. The first contact, in other words, did not arrive as a sudden rupture, but as a drawn-out dialogic emergence. It foregrounded the limits of human senses and highlighted the varieties of attention that might constitute intelligence in the cosmos. The tall, silver-bodied beings were a reminder that different evolutionary paths yield different communicative apparatuses. Their light and infrasound lexicon suggested a logic tuned to long-range caution, to vibrational fields, and to the modulation of living systems. The cornfields showed that human practices, humble as they may seem, the ending of that early chapter was not a conclusion, but a commitment. Observation protocols were tightened, seed banks were expanded, public messages emphasized patience and stewardship. The visitors remained at a distance, and the farmers continued their work, planting and harvesting in cycles that had shaped human calendars for millennia. Between the multitudes of light pulses and the low hums beneath the winds, a nascent ethic took shape, that recognition carries obligations, that curiosity should be met with care, and that a field of corn is not merely a crop, but a ledger of human attention. One that, when treated reverently, at the edge of the planet, beneath silver skin and wide eyes, two kinds of tending converged, one the product of human centuries of selection, and the other a practice of long-duration attentiveness encoded in light and infrasound. Neither offered a glossary of equivalents. Both demanded the slower work of learning to listen. The first contact taught a quiet lesson about the politics of attention, that to meet another intelligence is to accept that some of the most telling things one can offer are the things one saves. seeds in a bank, protocols for restraint, and the willingness to let communication unfold on an unfamiliar schedule. In that, what does it mean to discover that language itself has been keeping a secret? The question arrived as an engineering problem, an aesthetic puzzle, and finally as an ethical demand. How does one translate a speech that is written in light, in subsonic breath, and in the patient choreography of platforms and tides? The mission answered first with tools. A temporary translator conceived as a bridge between fundamentally different modalities of expression, and then with a slow, astonished understanding. The beings that held those patterns had known about Earth for a very long time. They had a name for themselves, which, when rendered through the carefully calibrated, the device itself was designed to be provisional but precise, a dialectic instrument constructed from the same logic that had guided earlier probes. It was not a single machine so much as a layered architecture, arrays of optical emitters and receivers coupled to ultra-low frequency transducers, neural nets trained on multispectral time series, a constraint engine that enforced conservation laws and physics-based priors. Engineers described it in clinical diagrams and matrices, a mapping function from photonic wavelets and pressure phase modulations to symbolic vectors in a machine-learned semantic space. But the work was as much art as arithmetic. Anchors matter in all translation. For human languages, it might be objects in a room. Here, the anchors were tides, the optical signature of millet and maize under particular angles of light, the rotation of the planet, and the long-period phasing of orbital transmitters that matched seasonal cycles. The temporary translator learned slowly to treat these environmental regularities as tokens. It assigned provisional labels when a trio of phenomena cohered, a particular banded light pattern that repeated with the same phase, offset as a tidal pulse, a low-frequency cadence that consistently preceded a change in plant reflectance, an orbital pulse train that synchronized. The first breakthrough was not a sentence so much as a referent, a recurrent complex of modulated light and infrasound, a composite pattern with internal punctuation and an obvious anchoring to the planet's axial frequency, began to return consistently in contexts where the visitors attended to the cultivated fields. The machine-aligned representation of that pattern sat in the semantic space next to other patterns associated with care, cyclical attention and repositories, the tidal channels that stored organic films, the orbital cylinders that preserved materials, and the sequences of pulses that coordinated maintenance cycles. It was an antique kind of astonishment, the sort of moment scholars have long written about when a Rosetta-like alignment appears, but it came wrapped in a new fragility. The visitor's lexicon encoded time on a scale unfamiliar to human cognition. Their names carried registers of provenance and stewardship, a token that did not simply point to book or seed, but encoded the act of ongoing guardianship across long durations. When those tokens were rendered into human parlance, they yielded the phrase the team translated as keepers of knowledge. The phrase loaded the instrument's meters and militated against fact. The discovery refracted into several complementary facts. First, the keepers had a clear archival practice. Their transmitters could be read, in part temporal strata and provenance, little metadata stamps appended to pulses, each one denoting when a given record had been added, when a maintenance cycle had occurred, and where in orbital or terrestrial space a particular artifact had been placed. Second, their attitudes toward contact were intentional. The prevalence of field-mediated transport, the city's quiet choreography, and the multiplicity of non-contact protocols to claim knowledge of Earth for a very long time needs calibration against the concept of deep time. The keeper's temporal perspective was layered. Some artifacts and records were recent in their scale of decades. Others were catalogued with a time-stamping practice that did not collapse neatly into human centuries but into orders of magnitude larger. Their archives contained echoes of events that, as far as human chronology could measure, predated the technological societies that had mapped the sky only in the last few centuries. The translator exposed sequences that appeared to document cycles, phases of cultivation, disturbances in atmospheric chemistry. History, as the translator began to reveal it, took shape not as a linear chronicle but as a palimpsest of adaptations. The Keeper's arc resembled a long human history writ over by different priorities. They began, the translated record suggested, as makers who engineered materials and shaped energy at scales responsive to local ecologies. Their early artifacts emphasized mobility and repairability, cylindrical modules that could be reconfigured, seam-based construction that favored modular replacements, adhesives and alloys designed for patchwork. Over long durations, political narratives were muted in the archive. Empires of kinetic conquest did not dominate their long story. Rather, the records encoded networks of custodial nodes, repositories where materials, seeds, and data were consolidated, catalogued, and sometimes ritualized. The Keepers did not collect for vanity, but for continuity. They prioritized redundancy and geographical dispersal, placing copies of irreplaceable lines, biological, chemical, and informational, in orbit on shelf-like terraces and even in tiled repositories embedded along tidal margins. There was evidence of learning from catastrophe. The archives contained traces of systemic failures, pulses that widened into error forms, maintenance schedules interrupted and then re-established at phase-shifted intervals, and correlations that suggested past events of large-scale disruption, stellar variability, resource reallocation, or pandemics among biological companions. Those failures did not inaugurate despair but adaptation. The Keepers rewrote protocol. They shifted from active intervention toward frameworks of preservation that accepted attrition as a predictable law. This ethical orientation was the clearest explanation for the Keepers' reluctance to interfere visibly with human affairs. Their doctrine, reconstructed from translated signals and correlated artifacts, emphasized three central precepts: to observe carefully, to preserve even when the original context had been lost, and to avoid introducing solutions that would collapse the possibility of native evolution. That doctrine created a form of cosmological humility. If one's role is to keep traces of many worlds, then imposing oneself on any one of them risks erasing the very diversity the Keeper's self-designation captured those precepts in compressed form. To call themselves keepers of knowledge was to claim custodianship and to legitimize a set of practices that were simultaneously technological and moral. Their libraries were not mere repositories of data. They were living protocols encoded in matter, polymeric films that sequestered seeds, layered alloys that stored thermoregulated microfilaments, and pulse trains that functioned as indexes. What the temporary translator framed as a kind of time-stamp spine running through their cultural corpus. These were not inert records, but for the mission's teams, the revelation provoked a cascade of reactions. There was an exhilaration that comes from being recognized by a broader intelligence. Behind it ran an ache that sounded like the ethics of being looked at. Humanity had been recorded, categorized, and deemed worth preserving. The moral weight of that attention made the record fragile in a new register. Not fragile because it might degrade, but fragile because the act of retrieval could become an act of violence. The mission confronted a set of questions that belonged more to philosophy colleges than to engineering halls. What obligations arise when another civilization? Practically, the translator's emergence restructured priorities. Technical teams moved to formalize communication, not in hopes of instant dialogue, but to establish a long-term ritual of exchange. Instead of flinging full-bandwidth interrogations into the sky, they proposed slow, legible signals that mirrored the Keeper's own cadence. Protocols were drafted that treated the Keeper's archive with the default assumption of non-exploitative access. Any retrieval would be incremental, minimally intrusive, and coupled with offers of reciprocal documentation. The mission's ethics committees invoked the Keeper's history, furthermore, reframed assumptions about technological progress. Their cultural choices made an argument against equating complexity with expansionism. The architecture of their city and the design of their transport taught an austere lesson. Systems optimized for endurance often look quiet, modest, and unambitious in ways humans initially misread as decay. A society that has mastered the art of preservation will tend to avoid spectacle. It will invest in efficient choreography and in redundancy rather than in ostentation. From the translator's decoded sequences, even as the mission absorbed these insights, the archive retained its elusiveness. Not all signals could be translated. Many patterns remained obstinately opaque, receding into the same kinds of incommensurability that initially motivated the translator's creation. Some pulses appeared to be internal bookkeeping systems, indexes of provenance whose semantics made sense only within the keeper's deep cultural logic. Others encoded multisensory phenomenology that human instruments could measure, but not feel. To be a translator, then, was not to solve a puzzle once and for all, but to commit to a. In the quiet months after the translation device produced its provisional gloss, a calmer narrative took hold in the mission's briefings. The discovery of the keepers did not answer the old cosmic riddles so much as it complicated them. Presence is not always intervention. Knowledge can be a form of care. Silence may be chosen for ethical reasons rather than imposed by absence. On screens and in seminars, the moral of the story was repeated like a catechism. Stewardship is an act that spans deep time, and those who can think in such scales will often choose to preserve rather than to possess. For listeners beyond the laboratories, the idea that there exist custodians of memory in the galaxy functioned as both comfort and reprimand. It was consoling to think that someone, somewhere, had been keeping archives of Earth and its seasons. It was disquieting to realize that a species' persistence can be registered and curated by others without that species' consent. The ethical tension became part of the public conversation: how to balance curiosity with respect, how to honor the keeper's principle of minimal interference while still participating. The translator, temporary by design, remained in place longer than intended. Its provisional mappings matured into a corpus of probabilistic correspondences that would guide generations of inquiry. Yet the instrument itself became a symbol of a particular humility. It implied that understanding across species requires not only equations and instruments, but also the patience to let meaning accumulate at the pace of seasons and the restraint to avoid transforming inquiry into appropriation. At the deepest level, the keeper's history reframed a human posture toward the cosmos. They had chosen, over cycles of flourishing and collapse, to become custodians of the forms that other beings had created: seeds, songs, artifacts, patterns of cultivation. Their archive argued against a teleology of consumption and toward a teleology of conservation. In doing so, it taught the mission and its observers a lesson in ethics that the temporary translator could render in no more elegant terms than that the act of naming. To call oneself a keeper carries with it an obligation. The translated records did not uplift humanity into a new prominence. Instead, they put human history into a different frame, one in which being noticed by the galaxy is less an elevation than a charge. The keeper's long view urged a kind of reciprocity, not of trophies, but of care. In the resulting silence, there was a form of conversation, not a rapid exchange of messages, but a patient accretion of attention, a commitment to preserve the threads that bind life across ages. For the observers on the plane and in orbit, the revelation was less a narrative of contact than an initiation. When the temporary translator finally fell quiet, its work recorded in archives of a different make, the mission's conclusion was modest: to be kept is to be entrusted with a story that outlasts its tellers. The keepers of knowledge, as their own transmissions declared, had devoted themselves to that trust. For humanity, to have been named in a register that crosses epochs was not a coronation. It was an invitation to join, incrementally and respectfully, in the slow labor of keeping. What does a graph confess when its axes are time and disappearance? The question compressed itself into a single image on a lab wall, a dense montage of charts, heat maps, and stitched photographs drawn from decades of passive listening, orbital imaging, and spectral archaeology. At first glance, the panels looked like any other catalogue assembled by a careful mission. Annotated frequencies, orbital element diagrams, pixel-by-pixel mosaics of ring systems and coastline terraces. But when those panels were layered and cross-referenced, a deeper pattern revealed itself. Lines that had once been judged incidentally. The montage, as a single extended argument, said something both simple and devastating. The galaxy had once had more than one civilization. It had had a plurality, an explicit alliance. The evidence was not a single dramatic object, but the accumulation of many small convergences. On the charts, the same modulation protocols recurred in disparate systems: pulse trains with identical packet framing, carrier harmonics that used the same error correction schemes, light rail motifs in orbital mechanics that echoed across planetary systems. Materials analysis of recovered artifacts in orbit and on surfaces showed common metallurgical strategies: alloys graded to survive certain cosmic ray flux profiles, layered metamaterials optimized for long-term thermal cycling, adhesives with identical isotopic markers suggesting shared manufacturing recipes. The Keeper's archives, the discovery reframed previous anomalies. Isolated beacons, once assumed to be local engineering, now read as relays on a broader highway. The cylinder fields around the pale planet were no longer singular curiosities, they were fragments of a once cohesive infrastructure that had linked many worlds. Satellites catalogued in other systems, previously described as debris fields or chance accretions, fit the same design grammar. The Keeper's pulse trains, once inscrutable, resolved into cataloguing metadata, stamps that recorded ownership, provenance, and custodial intent. Together, the visualizations suggested but elation was bratisation. There was elation, a cognitive thrill, at seeing disparate evidentiary threads align into a new narrative of galactic polity. But elation was braided with a quieter sensation, grief by analogy. The visual mass of orbital debris, the density spikes, was not an argument only for cooperation. It also contained time-stamped ruptures, with velocity vectors suggesting explosives, synchronous damping of signals across regions separated by light years. In layer plots of orbital debris, the density spikes were not gradual sedimentary scatterings, but abrupt precipitation events, sudden cascades of broken structures. In short, the Alliance did not simply wither. It had been wounded, and the wounds were visible across multiple archives: orbital, terrestrial, and spectral. Chart by chart, the story took on the cadence of an elegy. Time series of transmission activity, when viewed as an ensemble for many systems, revealed correlated declines, nodes dimming within decades of one another, maintenance pulse intervals lengthening until the regular beats slipped into irregular, then nothing. Where active repair had once been visible in thruster firings and maintenance illuminations, the data registered a silence that was not natural. It carried signs of interruption. In some systems, transient pulses persisted, the residual timber of machinery still holding to ancient schedules. The causes traced in the data were multiple and overlapping. There were signatures consistent with misadventure, localized wars whose energetics left telltale signatures in the interplanetary medium, deliberate kinetic engagements that shredded orbital infrastructures, directed energy exchanges that scarred planetary exospheres. The archives also recorded catastrophes less obviously human in design: neutrino fluxes suggestive of stellar collapses, gamma-ray bursts that arrived with geometries implicating nearby massive events, and chain reaction environmental collapses triggered by runaway feedbacks in The atlas of loss, when stitched together, suggested something like a cascade. An event in one node, military action or ecological collapse, would reverberate, disrupting supply chains. That disruption increased stress in neighboring nodes. A misaligned energy transfer could then overload defensive systems elsewhere. What began as a regional calamity could across decades become systemic. The Alliance's interdependence, once an engineering virtue, became a vector for contagion. But amid the wreckage and the synchronous fall-offs, there were survivors. Not survivors in the sense of single heroic individuals, but systems that had endured by design. The keepers, already visible in the archives as custodians, emerged as the principal lineage that persisted. Their survival was not simply luck. The visualizations made their strategy legible. Where other nodes concentrated on capacity for expansion, fleets of mobile habitats, energy platforms optimized for throughput, and large centralized manufacturing, the keepers had invested in redundancy, low-maintenance substrates, and distributed storage. The charts showed this as a different topology of infrastructure. Instead of mass tholls and concentrated power plants, their nodes were splayed, modular, and often semi-passive. They used low-bandwidth field, mediated transport and encoded archives in materials designed to weather radiative assault. The keepers' pulse train indexes revealed an epistemic design. The images reinforced these patterns. Megastructures elsewhere in the Alliance displayed grand geometries optimized for scale. The keepers' architectures tended toward low-profile, robust forms integrated with local ecologies. Materials analysis of their modules showed graded porosities meant to regulate thermal flux, layers formulated to trap and dissipate charged particles, and bonding chemistries that favored repairability using in-situ resources. Their orbital deposits had been intentionally decentralized, spread across multiple inclinations and semi-major axes. There was, of course, an ethical dimension recorded in the metadata. The keepers' logs contained explicit statements when translated about priorities, about the meaning of stewardship, about the need to preserve diversity rather than to extract it. In the translator's probabilistic renderings, these priorities were not mere rhetoric. They appeared as operational constraints: refusal to deploy high-entropy weapons systems at scale, restrictions on resource extraction that would destabilize local biospheres, protocols for non-interference in the developmental pathways of nascent intelligence. The Alliance had once begun. Human reaction to that mosaic of cooperation and collapse was complicated. The charts made the past legible, but also implicated their viewers in a set of moral questions. To be witness to a tableau where ethics and engineering had once been aligned, then unstitched, forced a reckoning. The images were not merely historical artifacts, they were ethical mirrors. Scientists in the mission rooms, while parsing anomalies and refining models, also felt the weight of recognition. An awareness that human civilizations might be seen in the same light by whoever wrote the keepers' indexes as pickups in a network. That moral recognition changed the mission's undertakings. Where earlier priorities had been curiosity-driven and opportunistic, the evidence of an alliance and its fall produced a new programmatic insistence: build with restraint, archive with redundancy, and prioritize non-disruptive interaction. The keepers' strategies offered techniques, materials, protocols, and timing schemes that were immediately practical. They also offered, more profoundly, a framework for evaluating human choices. If interdependence magnifies risk, then how does one balance the efficiency that connectivity provides against the fragility it creates? Technically, the mission adopted a twofold response. First, it re-engineered its own operations in the field to minimize perturbation. Probe trajectories were recalculated to reduce chance collisions. Sampling protocols were tightened to preserve context. Communication strategies moderated to avoid introducing synchronization effects that might entrain local systems into destabilizing rhythms. Second, it codified a new archival ethic inspired by the keepers: distribute copies of critical biological and cultural elements across diverse, resilient substrates, using coding schemes resistant to bit rot and the emotional arc of these decisions can be read in the visual rhetoric of the panels. Where graphs once showed only the hope of discovery, they now included the geometry of care. The images of the keepers' modules, once admired for engineering sophistication, took on a pedagogical tone. They were models of a philosophy that prioritized endurance. The juxtaposition of catastrophic signatures next to preservationist strategies functioned like a visual parable. To last is not merely to be powerful, it is to be attentive to the laws of deep time and to design with humility before those tides. There were darker lessons, too, embedded in the charts and images. The Alliance's fall proved that technological capability alone does not immunize a society against self-destruction. Some nodes collapsed under their own innovations, feedbacks unanticipated, supply chains that amplified stratification, and technological escalations that made second-order effects catastrophic. The imagery of a world's coastal terraces corrupting into chemically inert flats was not only a warning about weapons, but an indictment of carelessness toward the biosphere. In places where expansion overtook repair, where spectacle outpaced maintenance, the Keepers' persistence suggested a different cultural valor. They had learned that humility could be built into infrastructure, architecture that accepted attrition, algorithms that planned for loss, and social codes that prized preservation over triumph. The images of their decentralized archives, spread across orbital inclinations and planetary niches, functioned as an argument against the human default preference for centralization and for the monument. On a human scale, the charts demanded new kinds of grief. It was one thing to read about a lost civilization in abstract. It was another to watch their maintenance pulses trail away into the static as if a heartbeat had slowed and stopped. The mission's narrative voice, when recounting the Alliance's arc, veered into elegy. The graphical animations of nodes dimming were accompanied, in meetings and briefings, by a tactile silence, not theatrical but contemplative, a recognition that these charts were records of lives and choices, not only of engineering variables. Yet the visualization did not reduce the Keepers to mere cautionary tales. The same images contained the seeds of a different future. The Alliance's architecture, in its survivalist fragments, offered protocols for interstellar ethics that were both practical and humane. It suggested that a mature technological culture might define success not by instantaneous reach, but by the fidelity of its custody, how faithfully it tends seeds, how cautiously it responds to nascent life, how deliberately it distributes knowledge so that it might survive cataclysms of various kinds. That lesson resonated beyond the mission rooms. The public reception of the Alliance narrative combined wonder with an uneasy self-awareness. For many, the visuals invoked pride and humility in alternation. Pride at being part of a cosmos rich with cooperative possibility, humility at being a species whose future might depend on reconfiguring its own technological narratives. In policy circles, the charts catalyzed new conversations about shared standards for preservation, about treaty frameworks that prioritized archival integrity, and about the moral imperative to avoid replicating the Alliance. There were also practical consequences at the level of tools and design. The mission's engineering labs began to prototype materials and protocols inspired by the Keepers. Engineers sketched composites with graded porosity to reduce particle sputtering, power systems that could enter ultra-low energy modes and still preserve metadata, and encoding schemes that leverage predictable cosmological cycles, tidal, rotational, and orbital, as wake-up schedules for dormant archives. These prototypes read like translations of the images. The charts had not only diagnosed a historical pattern, but had also transmitted. But perhaps the most significant effect of the charts was its moral catalysis. Seeing an alliance that had once chosen to preserve plural forms of life, and then had been undone by forces both internal and external, reframed a central human question about ambition. The images asked, what does it mean to be successful when measured against the horizon of deep time? The Keeper's answer, now visible in slow motion through graphs and mosaics, offered a provocative response. Success was the capacity to be a steward, not a dominator. To design systems that outlived the visual record of alliance and collapse did not conclude with a single moral. It left open a space for experiment, for policy, and for communal imagination. The mission took that openness seriously. Its subsequent briefings emphasized not only cautionary lessons, but the possible virtues encoded in the Keeper's legacy. The charts became templates, mappings of how one might distribute archives, how one might code metadata for reanimation, how one might build infrastructures that avoid single points of failure. concluding the section that the individuals in the mission called, in an archival shorthand, the Alliance Dossier. The montage returned to an image of quiet persistence, a pulse train running not at the tempo of conquest but at the tempo of seasons, an orbital map punctuated with small, deliberate caches instead of monolithic hubs. It was not an image of victory so much as a design brief for humility. In the end, the charts confessed what images always do when assembled with care. They made a moral history legible. They showed a galaxy that had once coordinated its intelligence, built together, and then been rent by forces that could have been resisted by different choices. They showed keepers who chose, against the grain of expansion, to care and to preserve. And they offered, with the quiet insistence of data, a possibility that felt at once technical and ethical. That human beings, now named in the Keeper's indexes and visible in the galactic mosaic, could learn from that archive. Not to mimic the past blindly, but to adopt a stewardship of their own. What if the universe kept not only records but reserves? Banks of possibility folded into the fabric of space itself, waiting for a hand wise enough to unseal them. That idea settled over the mission like a second hypothesis. It was not a thought born of sensationalism. It arrived as a datum, a stubborn fingerprint in the noise, and then as a geometry in the maps, regions where vacuum fluctuations had been disciplined into ordered patterns, where the empty space between particles was not chaotic, but arranged with a kind of purpose. The pattern announced itself as an excess, a power density that outstripped any plausible source local to the objects in question. Instruments that had been taught to look for thermal excess, for nuclear decay, for the predictable glow of mass in motion, found instead a clean signature of something more elemental. Spectrometers recorded anomalous suppression in expected background fluctuations. Detectors designed to measure the jittery sea of virtual particles. The quantum froth that, on Earth, is an annoyance to be calibrated away. Reported ordered oscillations, a set of phase-locked perturbations in the vacuum itself. The first technical descriptions were precise and cautious. Subsequent public briefings adopted a gentler register, but both converged on the same realization. These were not mere power stations. They were patterning systems that controlled quantum fields, and by doing so, they modulated the very substrate of energy availability. To translate the effect without drowning in jargon, the teams offered metaphors that remained tethered to measurement. Imagine a sea whose surface can be made smooth or rough by a machine that orchestrates the tides of possibility at scales smaller than an atom. Where ordinary technology taps derivatives, chemical bonds, nuclear gradients, thermal differentials, this system tapped the wellspring, the zero-point energy of space. It did so by orchestrating quantum particles into collective states that behaved less like the capricious players of textbook quantum theory and more like a disciplined chorus. The chorus could be cued to release stored coherence. How such control was instantiated in hardware, if hardware is the right word, became the next layer of awe. The materials analysis of the Keeper's installations showed lattices of entangled nanostructures, arrays whose nodes were not merely conductive but quantum coherent across macroscopic distances. Those arrays functioned like many tiny clocks bound into a single organism, phase-locked, protected by layered shielding that suppressed decoherence and anchored to environmental cycles so they could be recharged by tidal fluxes, stellar neutrinos, and minute gravitational differentials. The result was that this is where the archive's moral and technical dimensions intersected. The Keepers had not only built these lattices, they had taught them ethics. The pulse trains preserved in their indexes were not merely status reports. They were rules embedded in operation, throttles that limited output to sustainable levels, phase codes that refused sudden large transfers, and built-in fail-safe topologies that would fragment a field before it could be exploited destructively. The archive's metadata described these constraints with a vocabulary that the temporary translator rendered as stewardship algorithms. The discovery of such a system reframed the earlier charts of alliance and collapse. If the galaxy had hosted a confederation, Its backbone had not only been trade routes and shared archives, it had been access to the substrate of energy itself. Those who controlled the means to reshape vacuum curvature had, in principle, the ability to route flows of usable energy across interstellar distances. With energy so abundant, material economies collapse and new forms of maintenance and risk emerge. The Alliance's engineering grammar, field-mediated transport, the existential reactions were immediate and layered. In observatories and council chambers there was an electric thrill, the idea that humanity could someday possess tools to free itself from resource-driven constraints seemed to validate centuries of longing. But that thrill sat next to a heavier emotion, the recognition that the very technology that could end scarcity could also end worlds. The mission's ethicists and engineers framed the dilemma in stark operational terms. A single unmoderated modulation of vacuum fields could alter local inertial frames, trigger catastrophic. The Keeper's own history, as read through the translator, illuminated the peril. The records hinted at episodes where field control systems were misused or misapplied, not always willfully, sometimes through cascading, emergent failure, producing results that were both immediate and slow. There were traces of localized metric perturbations that changed orbital dynamics, of sudden releases that fouled atmospheres with radiation, and of field interactions that excited resonances in nearby matter and induced catastrophic aging. These episodes, when plotted across the Alliance's networks, correlated with many of the embedded in the Keeper's designs was an answer to movement as well as energy, the physics of passage. The same ability to pattern quantum fields to extract power also allowed the Keepers to reconfigure local space-time metrics. Instruments reconstructed geometries consistent with metric engineering, localized modifications of the space-time interval that permitted displacement without the need to traverse intervening spatial coordinates in the normal way. The theoretical analogues in human literature, warp bubbles, wormholes, metric drives, were helpful starting points but inadequate to capture the Keeper's sophistication. Their technology, operationally, the Keeper's transit method resembled a choreography rather than an engine. A vehicle, a platform, or a packet of matter need only be synchronized with the lattice's phase to be lifted into a local deformation that connected two separated points in manifold space. From the observer's vantage, the motion appeared instantaneous. One instant, a platform sat in a slot between terraces. The next, it flashed in a distant orbital region. The travel times recorded in telemetry were shorter than light travel would allow, because the object had not traversed intervening. The implications were staggering. Such technology made galaxies small in practice, not in principle. It allowed the Keepers to move materials, seeds, and archives between caches distributed across a stellar neighborhood without the logistical weight of near-light travel. It explained how a confederation could coordinate across vast distances without centralized empires. The lattice knitted nodes together in energetic solidarity. The discovery also deepened the moral puzzle. The Keeper's archives were filled with design choices intended to minimize the temptation of instantaneous mobilization. Their transit systems were engineered to be deliberate and slow in one essential sense. The activation codes required phase alignments keyed to environmental cycles and long-period astronomical markers. In other words, using the lattice for rapid transit demanded not just technical capability but temporal commitment. The Keepers had intentionally inserted delays, moral friction. When the Alliance fractured, those delays mattered. Visualized histories showed nodes bypassing safeguards in moments of panic or aggression, short-circuiting caution, and enabling destructive uses. The cascade of failures that followed often began with an exploitation of the same lattice that otherwise sustained life, a repurposing of the energy system from custodian to instrument. The records read like a litany, bids for advantage, ad hoc reconfigurations of phase patterns, then a loss of control and synchronous decline. The technical lesson was chillingly simple. A technology that collapses friction The mission's response to this knowledge was multifold. On one axis were immediate, practical safeguards. Instrument teams devised non-invasive ways to measure lattice coherence and to detect anomalous phase patterns that might signal unsafe modulation. Protocols were proposed to hard-code fail-safe phase dispersal in any human attempt to replicate the technology. Local micro-shutters that would fragment coherence if certain entropy thresholds were crossed. Environmental priors that insisted on multispectral confirmation of benign operation. On another axis were political and ethical propositions. The discovery forced a reconsideration of expansionist aspirations. The existence of a turnkey route to unlimited energy and instant travel demanded not only treaties but a cultural reorientation. The Keeper's Archive offered more than engineering blueprints. It offered an ethic of embedded constraints. The mission's policy groups, drawing lessons from the Alliance's collapse, proposed a phased approach to knowledge sharing. First, deep learning about failure modes. Second, adoption of the Keeper's friction mechanisms as default. The human reactions were complicated and intimate. There was hunger, the sense that centuries of scarcity could be reversed, that the great problems of material care, climate, energy, distance might be addressed in a single reconfiguration of priorities. There was also fear, a quiet, ancestral fear that power that removes constraint will also remove accountability. In private notes and internal memos, mission scientists confessed to feelings that sounded like grief and longing at once, the pain of having, at last, a solution so magnificent that it risked being used for vanity or violence. The Keepers themselves, as an ethic printed into matter, continued to speak through their designs. The mission's translators rendered certain archival phrases into equivalents that human listeners could grasp. Phrases that emphasized patience, redundancy, and the privacy of the lived. The Keeper's messaging, when human devices could align to hear, seemed to say less about dominance than about keeping. They used the lattice to stitch together life across distances precisely so that those lives might endure, not so that one polity might outstrip another. That ethical posture carried practical consequences for the mission's choices. Rather than rush to replicate quantum lattice control, the mission prioritized conservationist research, how to use the Keeper's practices to distribute archives in ways that resiliently preserved ecological and cultural diversity, how to design low-bandwidth field corridors that could be used for retrieval in emergencies without enabling the fast, unchecked transit that had destabilized the Alliance. The goal became, in effect, to practice the Keeper's restraint, to use the discovery of infinite-like energy. There were inevitably tensions in the public sphere. Some voices demanded open access, arguing that any technology that could alleviate suffering should be democratized. Others urged secrecy and stringent controls, fearing that knowledge itself could be a weapon. The debates were not merely technical, they were arguments about the ecology of attention and the politics of trust. The mission offered, as a rhetorical move, the Keeper's own coded discouragements. The lattice itself had been designed with friction and temporal filters. Perhaps humans should follow that model because it was the product of cultures that had survived the long arc of danger by making. There was a subtler, philosophical consequence too. The existence of a system that could reconfigure space-time suggested that the universe's ballast, space and time, is not merely a passive stage, but a material to be engaged with. That realization shifted the metaphors humans used for their species. No longer only farmers and builders, they might become conservators of topology, gardeners of metric relationships. Such a reframing implied a humility commensurate with the scale of responsibility. To alter the stage is to alter many scripts simultaneously, some of which belong to others who will not be there. In the corridors where policy and engineering intersected, the mission formalized a new posture. The technology would be studied as a means of safeguarding, not as a shortcut to power. Research would proceed under the rubric of harm. avoidance, with architectures that defaulted to dispersion rather than concentration. International coalitions drafted agreements that echoed the keeper's archival stamps, shared custodianship, distributed caches, and interference protocols triggered only by broad consensus or existential emergency. Those measures did not abolish temptation. They simply recognized its inevitability and built the architecture of resistance into the design of inquiry. That, in itself, was a lesson of deep time. Technologies of vast potential can be framed either as tools of accumulation or as instruments of care. The keepers, in their long practice, had chosen care. Their legacy was not merely the lattice, but the quiet insistence that power deserves gatekeepers who themselves are bound by the discipline of leaving things for others. The final scenes of this chapter were not cinematic finales, but slow editorial choices, protocols drafted, conservative experiments approved, archives copied into distributed vaults, and the commitment to watch, to measure, and to restrain. The mission's voice, the voice that had narrated anomalies as modest technical events and then as moral frames, adopted a tone of patient humility. There was a recognition, now sharper than before, that discovery carries with it an obligation to keep. In the mission room, the charts of energy densities and phase coherences were pinned beside the earlier mosaics of alliance and collapse. The images read together like a cautionary hymn. Power is not merely an answer to want, it is a contextor of responsibility. The keepers had learned this and had encoded the lesson into lattices and schedules. Humanity, now singularly named in archives that crossed epochs, faced the task of learning the same ethic at its own scale. To find a system beyond human reach, a lattice that made energy abundant and distance pliable, was to confront an ethical horizon as wide as the galaxy. The instrumentality of scientific curiosity met, finally, the deliberate restraint of moral imagination. The mission concluded not with the triumphal claim that the technology would be owned and mastered, but with the quieter promise that knowledge would be stewarded. The universe, it seemed, offered reserves not to those who seized them first, but to those who could learn to keep what they did not own. What does a warning feel like when it arrives from a place that has already endured the same slow geometry of ruin? The question shifted the mission's attention from instruments alone to the moral ledger. Those instruments now insisted on keeping. The translator's work, slower than anyone had hoped and more precise than anyone had expected, had turned fragments of pulse and pattern into meaning. In the keeper's own index there was a sequence, repeated across nodes, that could be read as counsel, not an imperative of domination, but a cautionary notation about rhythms of resource use. The warning announced itself not as a flourish, but as a mapping of correspondences. Data tied together climate proxies on the pale planet's record with the keeper's field archives. Episodes of destabilization there, accelerated atmospheric turnover, runaway chemical feedbacks initiated by system-wide resource extraction, the collapse of maintenance regimes in response to short-term crises, appeared in the archive as lessons learned the hard way. The translator presented them as sequences of cause and consequence, and the meaning emerged with an austere clarity. The pale planet had entered a cyclical. Out of those pages the keepers had composed a caution meant for anyone who would listen. The temporary translator, having matured into a provisional lexicon, was able to render the message into a kind of human prose, careful to avoid false precision but frank in substance. The transmitted fragment, released through formal channels to Earth's councils, read in part, "Attention. Patterns repeat. The coupling of hunger, speed, and centralized extraction produced a set of feedbacks. Where redundancy fell away, risk multiplied. Preservation requires restraint. Preserve or perish." The briefing that followed unfolded in the way careful institutions unfold difficult truths. On screens in rooms used to televised calm, graphs were layered, orbital decay curves, isotopic spikes, the signature residues of past industrial activity. Across those diagnostic maps, overlays from the keeper's ledger annotated points where institutional choices had exacerbated environmental responses. The presentation's voice-steady documentary led with probabilities, with error bars and comparative scenarios. And yet beneath the statistical frame there pressed an unadorned moral. That insistence reshaped three conversations simultaneously. In scientific forums, models were rerun to incorporate the keeper's long-run priors, that distributed redundancy reduces systemic fragility, that energy abundance without friction accelerates destructive cascades, and that the architectures which maximize short-term throughput amplify long-term risk. Ethicists drafted frameworks that translated those priors into governance instruments, binding indices for redundancy, procedural constraints on large-scale extractive maneuvers, and a presumption in favor of distributed, low-entropy maintenance rather than centralized. Public reaction, predictably, was heterogeneous. For some, the warning validated anxieties already incubating in climate science and environmental activism. It became a clarifying lens through which ongoing crises, ocean acidification, polar melt, the destabilization of long-term carbon sinks, were suddenly legible, not as isolated problems, but as the kinds of slow feedbacks the keepers had catalogued. For others, the warning was uncomfortable. It challenged narratives of unbounded growth and technological salvation. Conspiracy and denial surfaced in older, familiar forms. The technical councils took a conservative and methodical approach. The mission proposed a set of actions based on the keeper's lessons: protect diverse seed lines and culturally embedded agricultural knowledge by distributing copies into multiple, geologically and astronomically distinct vaults; redesign infrastructural networks to favor modular redundancy and slow-fail properties rather than single-point efficiency; institute binding protocols around large-scale lattice or field-enabled projects that required multinational governance and time; delayed activation so that temptation to misuse power could be resisted. There was an underlying prescriptive humility to the proposal. It did not promise easy fixes. The Keeper's Archive offered examples of technologies that, if deployed without embedded constraints, made growth seductive and brittle in equal measure. The mission's counsel was therefore bimodal: pursue technological ingenuity, but simultaneously codify the political and cultural practices necessary to prevent that ingenuity from becoming self-consuming. In translated fragments, the keepers explained how their own alliance had eroded when the very networks designed for preservation were The transmission of that warning had immediate effects in institutions. Seed banks multiplied their redundancy, not as a technical exercise alone, but as a ritual of commitment. Local communities insisted on custodial ownership of biological lines rather than totalizing scientific control. Energy policy debates embraced the idea of imposed friction. Proposals that had once been anathema, limits on certain classes of deployment, mandatory latency and activation of powerful technologies, the institutionalization of dark stores of energy that could not be immediately accessed, moved from. But policy operates in a world of politics and human temporality. The warning's force did not erase short-term incentives. There were still voices advocating rapid deployment of lattice-derived energy and near-instant transport, arguing that the global poor required immediate relief and that constraints risked perpetuating inequity. The mission's response acknowledged that urgency, even while it insisted on caution. The keeper's lesson was not about denying technological uplift to those in need. It was about designing uplift that did not annihilate future possibility. The difference: in time, the warning acquired ritual forms. When the mission crafted its public communications, it did so not with dramatic proclamations, but with a set of concrete requests: preserve seed diversity, decentralize critical infrastructure, codify latency and distributed custodianship into new treaties, invest in repair economies, and commit, publicly and auditable, to metrics of redundancy. The public messages were paired with the archival record, images of the keeper's modular caches, charts of synchronous collapse, and the brief translated admonition that had first been broadcast. The effect was accumulative, and then came the moment of parting. Farewells in a cosmic registry are rarely cinematic. They are calibrated, deliberate exercises in leaving something intact. The mission's final acts on the pale planet were small and precise, ritualized gestures of custody rather than declarations of conquest. Archives were duplicated and physically redistributed across orbital inclinations and local geological niches, microscaled caches embedded in graded metamaterials, sealed in buffers that required environmental triggers for reanimation. Copies of the translator's lexicon, encoded in resilient media and bound to multiple environmental wake cycles, were left in situ with layered acts. The departure itself was not an epical blast-off, but a series of soft closures. The orbiters dimmed their steady pulses and recorded final, time-stamped notes, calibrations left as instructions, metadata describing provenance, and a short, public-facing sequence rendered by the temporary translator. The sequence was both simple and throbbing with consequence. We watched, we kept, we leave this here in trust. The choice now belongs to those who remain. Care or repeat. It was the keeper's maxim rephrased into a paean for attention. The mission's last transmissions were not calls for instant action, but invitations to a long practice. The message urged an ethos of small acts, scaled across generations, seed-saving, redundancy, conservative energy budgets, ritualized delays on high-power projects. It urged recognition that the human timescale is but a blink against the arc of planetary maintenance, and that some technologies should be approached with the posture of a conservator, not the appetite of an extractor. Across screens and plazas on Earth, the farewell was watched with the mixture that attends goodbye, grief, relief, and an odd, aspirational hope. For some, the final broadcast read like a reproach, a reminder that being noticed by the galaxy imposes obligations. For others, it was a gift, a heritage of lessons and designs meant to protect possibility over centuries. In classrooms and councils and workshops, the archive's images became a curriculum. The keeper's architectures were not to be imitated mindlessly, their ethics were to be internalized. The farewell named the shape of what caretakers. The keepers themselves did not remain as magistrates of human fate. Their presence receded into the background of the archive they had bequeathed. They had taught, by example and by caution, a way of being that prized longevity over dominance. The final transmission encouraged reciprocity, preserve what you can, share custodial responsibilities, and honor a plurality of lifeways across epochs. It closed in a phrase that the translator gently smoothed into human syntax. We keep so that remembering is possible. Keep what you can and teach the next keepers to keep. When the last coordinated pulses faded into the slow noise of the planet's night, the air in the mission rooms felt like a held breath. There were no fireworks for that descent into silence. Instead, instruments logged timestamps, engineers finalized handover documents, and ethicists archived the debates that would inform future governance. The physical craft folded its arrays and slipped into trajectories calibrated to avoid perturbing the planet's fragile systems. Human teams prepared to leave, not with triumph, but with a compulsion to build what the keepers had embodied, institutions that favor repentance. The farewell left behind, in the place where the plain met the sea and where cylinders still turned their slow revolutions, a quieter world than the one that had already been catalogued but not yet fully understood. Cameras recorded the terraces at dusk, green glints of photonic pathways winding into quiet, and the tidal channels bearing their modest loads. The archive, now several hands' work, remained as a ledger of possibility. It was a repository and a mirror. For humanity, to be included in that ledger meant to be called to answer. For the keepers, to leave it meant trusting that the species receiving the warning. What follows that departure is not a neat denouement. The mission's farewell functioned as both an end and an opening. The end of direct custodial intervention by the keepers. The opening of a long human experiment in stewardship. The archive's lesson is sober and unresolved. It does not promise that change will be easy or that history need not repeat itself. It only offers evidence and counsel. Systems that prioritize preservation, redundancy, and restraint are more likely to survive the slings and tidal turns of deep time. Those at the office and at the farm. The parting image was not a blast of triumphal light, but a slow dimming of a field catalogue, an archive closing its cover with the soft click of disciplined hands. In that quiet, there remained the human propensity to narrate and to act. The keeper's last lesson, both warning and invitation, landed as a collective responsibility to change the patterns or to repeat the catastrophe that the archive had so carefully spelled out. The mission's voice, when it returned one final time to public screens, framed the choice plainly. We were shown what happens when care is abandoned, it said. We were given a model for how to keep. Silence followed the transmission, not empty but full of potential. It was the kind of silence that invites work, the deliberate, patient labor of tending what can be tended and of recording what must not be forgotten. The mission departed. The keeper's lights dimmed, the archives remained, waiting for the slow, unglamorous work of keeping to be taken up by other hands. In the span of the galaxy, the farewell was small, yet in the measure of species it was an inflection. The gravity of that parting rested with those left behind. They could heed the archive's counsel and shift the rhythms of their age, or they could remain bound to the What do two civilizations trade at the edge of a conversation? What does a farewell become when it is less a parting than the formal handover of a trust? The moment the keepers prepared to withdraw was not cinematic in the sense of thunderous music and grand gestures. It was a careful choreography of engineering, ritual, and words rendered into the spare language that had bound all previous encounters, metadata, calibrated pulses, and precisely timed silence. In the days before departure, the mission's operations rooms were full of deliberate slowness. Decisions that would once have been made in a week were argued over months. The keeper's archives had already changed what counted as evidence. Now they would dictate what counted as custody. The question at the center of every meeting was practical and ethical at once. What is owed to a species whose very survival had been catalogued by strangers who professed to keep rather than conquer? The answer emerged as a set of small, exact acts rather than a single public spectacle. The keepers did not leave with a flourish. They left an object. The object was small enough to be held in two cupped hands, though hands in this context were human approximations of motion and purpose. It was not a relic, nor a gift in the sense of a prize. It was constructed to be a repository, a physical contract, an index, and a set of instructions all folded into one compact geometry. Its outer shell resembled a dark, matte stone when seen at reflectance angles familiar to human optics, but instruments revealed a finesse that betrayed an engineering philosophy tuned to endurance. The surface was microtextured to scatter micro. On a functional level, the device was astonishingly simple and advanced at once. It contained a star map unlike any cartography the mission had known, multi-layered coordinate systems that did not merely plot positions in three-dimensional Euclidean space, but encoded relational histories. The long arcs of motion that objects followed over millennia, the phase relationships between nodes that made lattice-assisted travel possible, the habitual corridors where caches and archives had been scattered to minimize correlated failure. The map included not only vectors but procedures, timing windows keyed to stellar cycle. Beneath that cartographic layer, the device carried scientific data that reoriented several disciplines. Chemical libraries encoded with tomographies of materials engineered to endure radiation, algorithms describing low-entropy repair cycles that could be implemented with modest, locally available resources, models of lattice coherence that were deliberately simplified and capped, the keeper's own engineering for brakes rather than uncontrolled acceleration. There were also cultural dossiers, indices listing seed lines, genetic diversity metrics, schematic patterns for repair of urban materials, and metadata. The device's locking mechanisms were as meaningful as its contents. Access was gated by nested time anchors and environmental priors rather than by keys held by any one organization. The first tier required a consensus of authenticated signatures from multiple independent institutions across different regions of Earth. The second tier demanded the demonstration of repair capabilities at a defined, measured threshold. The third tier opened only when patterns of stewardship could be statistically shown to favor redundancy and local custodianship over immediate extraction. In plain terms, the device would not yield its deepest technical. When the handover occurred, it was mediated, as every public act had been, by translation and by ritual restraint. The keepers did not speak in human words, but the temporary translator. The hybrid array of photonic and infrasonic mapping tools assembled by the mission rendered a phrase that had recurred in the keeper's indices. It was not a sentence of command, but an injunction and an invitation folded together. In the mission's common tongue, it was rendered simply and deliberately. We keep. When keeping is possible, come seek us. That rendered phrase circulated in the rooms of governments, in the corridors of universities, and in the quiet gatherings of communities that had long kept seed banks and oral histories. It became, overnight, a hinge for policy as well as for feeling. It was a ritualized line offered by custodians who were leaving the ledger in human hands, but only insofar as those hands agreed to the habits the ledger demanded. Emotion followed protocol. The observers felt awe and an almost painful humility. For many, the device's presence made abstract debts suddenly tactile. The small shell on the table, with its layered maps and its stewardship locks, was a test object in the oldest ethical sense. Would the species that had been catalogued know how to inherit responsibility? There was relief, too, tempered and cautious. The keepers had not left humanity to itself entirely. They had provided not an unmediated power, but a scaffold for learning how to steward new capabilities without. Responses unfolded in layered ways. Scientific teams started with the technicalities, how to copy the openly accessible parts of the device for distributed backups, how to design verification schemas to ensure data integrity, how to simulate the environmental priors the device would demand. Engineers prepared to translate the keeper's conservative lattice models into safe experimental protocols, closed-loop, offline emulation systems that could test phase-lock dynamics without risking field deformation at planetary scales. Materials. Scientists catalogued the refractory alloys and composite matrices included in the library and discussed. Policy responses were immediate and profound. The device's access structure catalyzed a global conversation about distributed custodianship. Councils drafted frameworks that matched the keeper's own constraints, multi-party governance, time-delayed access to powerful technologies, and a presumption that archiving and repair protocols should be codified as public goods. Seed banks in the humble towns and the gleaming labs found themselves elevated into a new ecological and civic architecture. Copies of the normal public layers of the device were distributed across trusted repositories on every continent. Beyond institutions, there were rituals, communities that had long practiced small acts of preservation. Seed stewards, artisans who mended ships and roofs, archivists who repaired brittle pages by hand, found their labor suddenly recognized for its deep value. The keepers of human traditions were invited into advisory roles. The mission's briefings began to include everyday practitioners alongside high theorists. The keeper's ethos, which had once felt like a doctrinal set of engineering choices, took on a human face. To keep, it was clarified, meant to save not only data and infrastructure. Public messages carried a balanced tone. The mission's voice worked to temper triumph with obligation. On broadcasts, the keeper's translated phrase, more plaintive than boastful, was repeated and reframed. It became a manifesto for a kind of stewardship that looked forward to technologies the keepers had mastered while cautioning against letting novelty outrun care. The phrase, "we keep," when keeping is possible, come seek us, was not a promise of assistance on demand, it was a condition. It implied that the keeper's return, should it occur, would not be a rescue, but the resumption of a relationship between custodians. Those words also spurred humility. The promise of a later meeting, a meeting when humanity was ready, placed the burden of readiness upon human practices, on political maturity, and on cultural restraint. Acceptance of that condition required time and behavioral change more than it required scientific breakthroughs. It demanded that humans institutionalize patience, that they accept frictions and delays as virtues rather than obstacles. For many, that requirement felt like an ethical stretch. For others, it was a relief, a cosmic incentive to. The departure was measured in small gestures. Orbital pulses dimmed in prescribed phasing windows so as not to desynchronize local archives. The keeper's transmitters sent one final packet structured to act as an index, a spatial checksum mapped onto the device itself, so that any recipient could verify the authenticity of the object against distant pulses. Then, in a calibrated silence that no orchestra could have improved upon, the keepers retreated along the slow corridors of their own ethics. Their departure was less the closing of a door and more the sealing of a vault with a coin embedded into the hinge. The immediate legacy of the handover multiplied in mundane ways. Universities established interdisciplinary chairs on custodial technologies. Cities reconfigured maintenance budgets to favor longevity. Energy policy committees began including ethnographers and community seed keepers at the table. The device's star map reshaped investment priorities. Instead of sprinting to master lattice leaps, research funds shifted to understanding how to embed breaks and distributed checks into any future energy architecture. Small towns began to host replication libraries, at the level of individuals. The device became a mirror. People who had once measured progress by the speed and reach of technology found themselves drawn into the work of tending. Craftspeople reported renewed respect. Students took internships in conservation rather than in immediate extraction industries. Narrative culture shifted. Stories about heirs and inheritances replaced stories about conquest and novelty in many circles. It is hard to quantify such cultural shifts in the short term, but their direction was clear. The onto ethic of preservation seeped into policies and daily routines. There were inevitably dissenting currents. Some actors wanted immediate access to the device's deeper layers and argued that the world could not wait to solve immediate crises before mastering new technologies. Others feared that the keeper's conditional promise was paternalistic, a distant power testing whether humanity would accept an externally imposed moral regimen. Those debates were loud and messy and necessary. The device, by its design, was meant to force them. It refused to be an easy emblem to be co-opted by any single agenda. Over months and years, the immediate drama softened into a long practice. The mission codified protocols that institutionalized the keeper's ethics in human law. The device's locks were not simply physical barriers, but became legal and cultural thresholds. Institutions learned to pass audits of stewardship and to demonstrate redundancy in ways the keepers could measure. Communities learned to translate their local practices of care into measurable metrics that aligned with the device's priors, the diversity of seed lines, the redundancy of storage, the existence of distributed repair networks. Perhaps the deepest consequence was not technical, but temporal. The handover demanded a change in horizon. That change was not an edict, but an invitation. Imagine policies that succeed not over 5-year plans, but over centuries. Measure success in terms of persistence rather than novelty. The small device made deep time into a practical conversation. It asked whether humans could make the kinds of unsexy, patient investments that increase the odds of flourishing in the long arc. For those who took the work seriously, it produced new institutions that valued the slow accumulation of, and the promise remained. The translated line about return, The keeper's condition for future contact hung like a calculus in the cultural bloodstream. It made the possibility of reunion contingent upon demonstrated habits of keeping. That contingency shifted the shape of ambition. It reframed success rather than being the moment a species seizes untethered power. Success became the moment a species chooses to bind power to the practices that ensure possibility for those who come after. When the last of the keeper's pulses receded into background noise, the object remained. It sat in a vault that was watched by many eyes and tended by many hands. It was copied, distributed in safe public layers, and kept in an original that required consensus to open. For some it was a test, for others a sacred trust. In any case, it became the beginning of a long apprenticeship. What is a promise when it is recorded in matter and then left to the stewardship of others? In this case, it was a compact between civilizations, written in code and in constraint, that reframed the meaning of discovery. The keepers had not endowed humanity with an immediate path to omnipotence. They had left a small, patient engine of learning, maps for travel tied to ethics, data for repair bound to restraint, and a phrase that was at once an offer and a challenge. We keep when you can keep. As we keep, come find us. The mission returned, not with triumphant conquest, but with a new vocabulary for governance, a new set of rituals, and a palpable obligation. The device, modest in scale, vast in consequence, would be a touchstone for the kind of species humans might become. It asked for humility, for the slow labor of tending, for the art of leaving things behind in better shape than they had been found. It promised no miracles, only the possibility of future rendezvous, a meeting conditioned on the willingness to keep. And so, the mission closed that chapter, not with a final declaration, but with the quiet, enduring shape of a covenant. The keeper's lights dimmed along predictable phasing. The device rested under a glass dome in a small, secure room watched by many institutions. Outside, people resumed their work, in labs, farms, and classrooms, now keyed to a new standard to be ready for return. Humans needed to learn the art of keeping. The promise of reunion, offered in a measured phrase and sealed within a small, unassuming object, would not be fulfilled by a technological leap alone. It is an odd thing to be given the map of the stars and told that the route home is not merely geometric, but ethical. Yet that is the trust the keepers left behind. A device that charts galaxies and also charts restraint. The final human act was not to claim possession, but to accept stewardship. The commitment that followed was not a ceremony, but an accumulation, policies revised, seed banks strengthened, institutes founded, communities taught to measure success by what they could preserve rather than what they could consume. When that work had been done, slowly, often unremarkably, over years and generations, what does leaving look like when leaving is not an escape but a promise kept in reverse? That was the image that accepted shape as the mission prepared to close its ledger, not a triumphal slingshot away from a conquered world, but a measured withdrawal that tried, as best any human endeavor could, to be small where it might have been large, to be gentle where it could have been brutal, and to be patient where impatience had been calibrated out of every other decision. The question that framed the final hours was not, who takes, but who tends. Once the tasters, the vessel that had carried instruments, protocols, and a modest human ambition retraced the arcs it had used to approach. Its departure was choreographed like a ritual rather than executed as technology showmanship. Thrusters fired with the kind of moderation that is remembered in mission logs, micro-impulses timed to avoid stirring the tidal dust, reaction wheels spun up in sequence steps so their electromagnetic footfall would not realign a delicate transmitter, arrays folded with the slow arithmetic of thermal contraction in mind. There was no grand acceleration. The ship did not slam the throttle to max. On the plain by the sea, the thing left behind were not trophies, but trusts. Duplicate copies of the translator's progressive lexicon sat nested inside. Graded vials, seed libraries, both ancient and newly gathered, were scattered across geologically distinct niches, micro-archives of cultural practice. How to repair, how to sew, how to bake bread in a world with different humic chemistry, were set into polymer caskets that dissolved only when humidity and microbial assays matched safe thresholds. These were not spectacular acts. They were the slow, repetitive work. The mission's last transmissions were themselves modest. The translated record, once the keeping device's locks had been verified, was left as a packet readable by broad-spectrum receivers and encoded with the same conservatism the keepers had taught. It included checksum star charts tied to phase windows, a catalogue of the seeded strains stored across vaults, a catalogue of the materials and adhesives used in the terraces, and a set of human protocols, not laws, but appeals: do no harm, minimize extraction, preserve diversity. The packet ended with a phrase that had taken on the weight of scripture within the mission: we keep what you can. Rooms that had been full of algorithmic chatter and cascading telemetry did not fall silent after the last transmission. They hummed with aftercare. Engineers double-checked d-orbit vectors. Archivists ran one more verification on the metadata threads connecting the physical caches to their orbital indexes. Ethicists, who had once been peripheral to budgetary conversations, now had chairs at operational tables. In the public square, the message forced a new vocabulary. Newspapers found themselves printing maintenance schedules beside op-eds, schools introduced lessons in distributed stewardship, local workshops in distant. The planet, meanwhile, did not change to suit farewell. It continued its slow work of tide and light. The terraces shimmered in the late day like a low city breathing. The green bands of photonic traffic pulsed on their regular cycles. The cylinders in orbit kept their half-understood rhythms, some still pulsing, some fading, some arrhythmic and haunting. From the ship's aft cameras, the world receded in carefully measured frames: coastline, terrace, channel, and then the fuller blue of atmosphere bending toward horizon. The last close-up relayed in real-time matched, and then overlaid, pages of human emotion written into geophysical. There were small scenes, too, that would not make data charts, but would remain lodged in public memory. In a coastal village, a group of farmers wrapped seed packets in waxed cloth and placed them in a communal chest. They did not do it for fame. They did it because someone who had been an engineer had taught them, years earlier, that redundancy survives storms better than a single vault. In an urban school, children learned to repair torn textiles rather than to replace them, and the lesson took root with an odd intensity: the idea that longevity is a skill as much as it is a policy. In a university lab, scholars built institutional rituals tightened around the device left in custody. The vaults where the object rested were not simple, secure rooms. They were curated environments in which accessibility itself was governed by practice. The first tier of that governance was legal. Multinational treaties that codified rights to access. The second was technical. Biometric and cryptographic layers that required distributed keys. The third was ethical. Community audits and transparency assurances. Together they formed a living contract with the planet and with time. It was a form of governance that treated preservation as a Across the archives, the keeper's voice lingered like a watermark. Their records, the mission had translated and retranslated, did not present a clean moral calculus so much as a set of engineered habits. Their note was practical: decentralize, encode durability, create fail-safes, set limits on instantaneous mobilities. Their own survival story, recorded in the mosaics of decreasing maintenance pulses, served as a negative proof of the principles they advanced. The planet's terraces were a demonstration site and a lecture hall simultaneously. Look forward to the work of keeping, or accept the. Even so, leaving produced grief. The mission's public briefings did not hide that. The tone was not heroic, it was sober, a species looking back at a place where evidence suggested human-like care had once been practiced in forms that were not human at all. A species that had been noticed and that was now left with the obligation to prove itself worthy of attention. Grief took many shapes, some of which belonged to decision-makers and some of which were private. The grief of a technician who had spent nights tending an array. The grief of a farmer who had watched worms in a sample fade when exposed to different chemical contexts. Those departure also carried a curious form of relief, the kind that arrives after a long, intense vigilance. The instruments that had watched for years, radar arrays, spectrometers, and neural net translators, cycled down into maintenance modes. Some of their tasks were passed to local observatories and to citizen scientists who had been taught to read the keeper's indexes. The relief came with the knowledge that the work would persist, not as a broadcast spectacle, but as a collection of ongoing labors, scheduled seed transfers, periodic audit cycles, maintenance drills for orbital caches. The mission left behind a choreography of care. Near the ship's final telemetry burst, there came one last exchange worth noting in the public record. It was not a conversation as humans usually conceive conversation, and yet it carried the weight of benediction. The keeper's long synced pulse train, a ribbon of harmonics that had been part language and part clock, adjusted subtly at the moment of the ship's final maneuver. The temporary translator, having been left in a passive listening configuration, rendered a fragmentary line into human cadence. "We have watched your first acts. Keep what you can. Teach." It was left when the vessel crossed the threshold of the planet's influence, and the last of its wake faded into the pale noise of interstellar space. The cameras recorded one final frame, the planet in partial shadow, the coastline an emerald sigil, and the orbital cylinders catching the sun in the way only things made for endurance can, with matte glints that spoke of repair and long service. The ship's log closed with a line that was at once technical and tender. Departure nominal. Archives distributed. Vows recorded. Those words were the language of bureaucracy shaped by awe. The narrative that followed the mission's exit was not a neat story of instant triumph or sudden revelation. Instead, it continued as a long, uneven test of habits. Conferences multiplied around the world, repair economies received funding, seed banks were legislated into public commons, architectural codes were adjusted to prioritize repairable surfaces, and educational curricula incorporated the ethics of long-term custodial practice. The keeper's ethos, once a translation artifact, seeped into lived policy. To the degree that these reforms bore fruit was a question to be answered by later generations, and whether humanity would accept the steadiness required by deep time remained unresolved in the months and years that followed. Old incentives persisted, rapid growth, immediate returns, and the political calendars that often compressed decisions into electoral receipts. Yet alongside that continuity, there emerged new narratives, quieter but persistent, stories in which longevity is valorized, where a successful economy is one that designs in repair rather than replacement, and where the moral progress of a culture can be measured in its capacity to keep 1,000 small trusts rather than in its capacity to accumulate. The ship, now an object of faint pings in a spreadsheet somewhere, continued on its trajectory. Its instruments turned their faces toward the widening darkness, calibrating for the long haul. In the quiet of those automated watches, the mission left a register, a series of small protocols that, when repeated over centuries by many hands, might accumulate into a habit robust enough to withstand shocks the archives had catalogued. The keepers had not given a panacea. They had given a covenant, practical defaults, a small device with locked doors, and an ethic inscribed into matter. When the planet at last slipped from view and an expanse of stars threaded the rear windows into a field of pinpricks, the ship's log recorded the last human-facing message, transmitted as both an urgency and a comfort to the listening world below. "We will watch from afar. The caches remain. The device will unlock only when we, collectively, have learned a new patience." The transmission was logged, archived, and added to the set of decisions future councils would consult. In the long moderation that followed, the human imagination settled into a new posture. The cosmos was no longer simply a place to conquer or a blank map to fill. It was a field in which responsibilities could be planted like seeds and tended with an ethic of redundancy. The mission had shown, through instruments and through restraint, that to be noticed by others is not a prize, but a trust. It had shown that the secret the keepers kept was not only practical but moral. To preserve possibility for the future is itself an art that requires daily, uncelebrated work. And so the vessel continued away from the terrace and the cylinders, away from the quiet rapprochement of the cornfields and the tall watchers, until the blue of that world became a sliver and then a soft receding glow. The ship's wake was a faint line of particles and photons, catalogued and reverently stored. Instruments recorded one last calibration, a measurement of the planet's overall chromatic bloom as it slid into the background of stars. The tonal log annotated it with a single human phrase, both literal and metaphoric. Planet sinks into blue. They left with the knowledge that the cosmos may be populated not by conquerors and monuments, but by keepers and quiet covenants. The keepers of knowledge had opened a door and then closed it with a condition, stewardship, as a precondition for deeper contact. The mission had stepped through that doorway, looked back, and then retreated with restraint. And perhaps that was the most human thing of all, to leave a place with a suitcase of small promises and an ethic of return, to trust that another species, or later generations of humans, might take up the slow labor of keeping. When the ship left orbit, the planet receded, sinking in blue light. We may not be alone. They are waiting in a remote corner of the universe,